Unless you've been living under a rock for the last 100 years, you'll have heard of a little thing called the Walt Disney Company. Founded in the 1920s by its eponymous creator, the company saw great success throughout the early and mid-20th century, and when the Disney Renaissance began in the late 80s, their movies became a consistent backdrop to modern life. Luckily for us, this renaissance coincided with the rise in popularity and accessibility of video games for the common household. A chance for more marketing, a way to grow their consumer base, and to infiltrate the lives of families to a greater degree all at once, this opportunity was grabbed by the mouse with both hands, and lo, the Disney movie tie-in video game was born.
But what exactly counts as a tie-in? Well, to answer that, we first have to set some rules about what we do or don't consider a Disney movie, especially as the company seems to be steadily acquiring everything. For our purposes, it must have had a theatrical release, so no straight-to-video or TV movies, and it has to have been released under Disney's name, not through one of its subsidiary companies, such as 20th Century Fox or Touchstone Pictures. We will be including Pixar, due to their films commonly being branded as Disney Pixar, but we won't be including anything by Lucasfilm or Marvel Studios. Though if you do want a Star Wars or Spider-Man list, you're in luck, as we've ranked those already. In short, if it doesn't say Disney on the poster, you probably won't see it here.
In order to qualify for this list, a game must be tied to a specific movie rather than to an entire franchise and based on that movie, whether that's by following the plot, expanding upon it, or using just part of it. We don't mind which it is, just don't take the characters and plonk them somewhere unrelated and out of context, is all we're asking. Like usual, we're not covering edutainment, mobile, browser, or handheld LCD games, and we'll also be discounting coloring or Photoshop-style scene creators, reskins of generic titles like pinball or chess, and any game without an official retail or arcade release. And no, buying the cereal box it came in doesn't count. We're also not considering re-releases or collections, and ports will be covered in the original game's entry, though drastically different versions won't affect its rank.
To determine the rankings, we fed these games into our complex algorithm machine, which takes into account critical review scores, audience retention, commercial performance, and just a dash of our own opinions. Finally, we're putting a spoiler warning in place for both the movies and games on this list, just to be safe, but we're sure that most of you won't need it.
With all of that nice and clear, let's rank 'em. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and this is every Disney movie tie-in video game ranked from worst to best.
Number 109, Hannah Montana the Movie, 2009, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, and DS. No, we've not forgotten the rules already. Despite being a Disney Channel creation, Hannah Montana found her way to the silver screen and bagged a spot on this list for her tie-in game. And what a place to claim. Receiving unfavorable reviews from critics and users alike, Hannah Montana the Movie brings us the worst of both worlds with this mediocre offering. As in the film, the game sees Miley revisit her hometown to reconnect with her family and mundane roots. Ride a horse, flirt with the boy fixing the chicken coop, and undertake tasks for the townsfolk to progress the story and unlock stages for Hannah's performances. Unfortunately, this involves completing mini-games of varying quality and a pointless back and forth between NPCs that have nothing worthwhile to say. After herding animals into their pens like a particularly awkward human sheepdog, the performances should provide a welcome change, but watching Hannah prance around with minimal interaction really doesn't give players the excitement they'd be hoping for. The rhythm sections aren't much better either, as the inputs don't quite match the beat of the songs due to inaccurate timing. The most entertainment to be had here came from the rumours that the Wii version could be used to hack the console. This caused a surge in demand for the game on the second-hand market in 2011, but left many would-be scalpers red in the face when said rumours proved to be false. Yeah, this probably could have been a lot better game. Number 108, Disney's Mulan, 1998. Game Boy. Let's get down to business. To be disappointed that this game is far less fun than the film that it's based on. Oh, and to defeat the Hunts as well, I suppose. In the movie Mulan, the eponymous protagonist is an intelligent heroine who kicks behinds and takes names to honor her family and protect her country. The game, however, showcases none of her character and determination. Instead, one of her defining features is bad collision detection, and she is capable of little more than basic platforming and throwing rocks. Just like me, actually. The setting is appropriate appropriate and follows the events of the film once Mulan has joined the army, but with no comedic dragon and posing little challenge for either seasoned or inexperienced players, Disney's Mulan feels as bland as the grayscale it's presented in. Did we mention it was released just 2 days before the Game Boy Color? Yeah, that was badly timed. I would say the final boss fight is anticlimactic, but the reality is that the game doesn't build up enough for the climax to be anti. In the movie, Mulan's battle with Shan Yu ends with a well-placed rocket from Mushu, but here, you're on your own, and it's either by luck or perseverance that you knock Shan Yu back into the fireworks that defeat him. Even this explosive ending doesn't help, but that may be because it looks less like a New Year's display and more like a couple of sad sparklers in the rain. Number 107, The Santa Claus 3: The Escape Clause, 2006, Game Boy Advance. The Santa Claus 3: The Escape Clause sees the player controlling a normal person with normal problems alongside their famous alter ego. Sound familiar? I never thought I'd be comparing Hannah Montana to Father Christmas, but here we are. For the player character, Scott, better known as Santa since the first Santa Claus film, Christmas is the order of the day. Mediocre but serviceable platforming levels are littered with typical wintry baddies to defeat or avoid and cookies to collect off the floor. Don't eat those. Aside from the stills that summarize the story, there's little that ties the game to the movie, and while the gameplay is okay and the controls are fine, both the level design and enemies lack variety. Jack Frost's plot to depose Scott doesn't feature until it's actually carried out. Off-screen, of course, and the main contrast between their rule is whether the North Pole is decorated with gingerbread chic or is an icy shopping centre complete with security guards. Reclaiming the mantle of Santa doesn't involve Frost invoking the escape clause, the thing the film is literally about, but instead sees Scott having a snowball fight with his frozen foe. A boss battle isn't an inappropriate choice for an action platformer, but it's certainly an odd one here. This all combines to make the title feel less like a Santa Claus game and more of a Santa Claus game. Without the E. This joke only works when written down. Number 106. Around the World in 80 Days, 2004, Game Boy Advance. With a mix of physical and spoken comedy that works well on screen, Around the World in 80 Days is a fun, albeit mindless watch, perfect for when you want a bit of silliness with the spectacle of Jackie Chan's martial arts buffoonery. Plenty of action-packed fight sequences, the race against time to traverse the globe, and a handily segmented format all sounds like elements that would make for a good game, right? Wrong. While it stays true to the plot of the movie and levels take cues from the countries visited throughout the trip, this globe-trotting tie-in stumbles beyond its already average inspiration. As in the film, the content relies on outdated stereotypes and tropes which include a horde of black-clad ninjas and a carriage-hopping cowboy fighting sequence on a train. The controls were criticized for their unreliability, levels for their predictability, and the audio for its unchanging soundtrack. Enemies have little to distinguish them, with the same approach and attacks working regardless of what weapons they wield. Gameplay is repetitive, and with no combos or incentive to plan attacks, distracted button mashing is a legitimate tactic. Especially considering the hard work and finesse that goes into Jackie Chan's expressive fights and the cleverly choreographed escape sequences, the game falls short of its potential. Instead of an entertaining adaptation, it's just a mediocre side-scrolling beat-em-up, and they didn't even use Arnie's likeness. Around the World in 80 Days? No thanks, I think I'll stay at home and play something else. Number 105. Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 2001. Game Boy Color. Released to capitalize on the movie coming to DVD, this is the only tie-in video game Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs got. Yes, we know about the cancelled Atari tie-in, and no, we're not counting it. The key part of that sentence is the word cancelled. We can't judge an incomplete game after all. Aimed at a young audience that wouldn't mind the bland gameplay or short runtime, Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the Game Boy Color was nonetheless criticized for being a snooze fest and not the sort that Sleepy would enjoy. Consisting of simple minigames and short walking sections that most children could complete in their sleep, even on the harder difficulty, the title posed little to no challenge. The most intense part of the game is the level in which Snow White must dodge easily avoidable bats as she winds through a dark forest maze, and even that wouldn't qualify as mild peril. But whether catching plates as the dwarf's domestic homemaker or collecting diamonds in the mine as one of the descriptively named little guys, the film's influence is evident throughout the levels, even if the atmosphere is not. However, the classic appeal of hand-drawn illustrations is also absent, with the vintage warmth of the movie lost thanks to the graphical limitations of the handheld. We can't necessarily be mad at the game for that, but we can be mad at the unforgivable lack of hi-hos. Number 104. Wreck-It Ralph, 2012. Wii, DS, and 3DS. We come now to a video game of a movie about video games. Oh boy. We already know how movies based on games generally go, and while Wreck-It Ralph is a surprisingly decent film, this game makes up for that by sucking enough for both of them. Set after the events of the movie, Wreck-It Ralph the game focuses on the relationship built between Ralph and Felix during the film and sees them facing off against the Cybugs once again. It's time for teamwork, but instead of co-op, this means swapping between the duo while the other waits in the UI like a personified alternate weapon set. Any sense of cooperation is lost as the heroes never interact physically, and worst of all, the reason for swapping feels contrived rather than clever. Why can't Ralph crouch? We saw in the film he can sit and slouch, so surely it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for him to duck through a low doorway. And why Fix-It Felix can't climb ladders, especially considering that he's supposedly a handyman, is beyond us. One of the movie's celebrated points was cameos from established gaming franchises, and while some of the fictional games from the film are featured here as levels, there's a disappointing lack of nods to real ones. These small pieces of fan service could have brought a much-needed boost of excitement and recognition to this otherwise blandly repetitive and linear game. Number 103, Frozen Olaf's Quest, 2013, DS and 3DS. Considering just how successful 2013's Frozen was, you'd expect it to have all manner of video game tie-ins. Platformers that make use of Elsa's powers to create objects and surfaces, races that test Kristoff's sled handling skills, or maybe even puzzles that do, something with the trolls. Come on, they're made to be pushed around and rolled into things, use them! However, other than typical mobile games that are unfairly addictive, Frozen Olaf's Quest is all we've got. The game plonks players into the icy shoes of the most lovable snowman since, well, the snowman, I suppose, and if you're a small child, then you could have a worse introduction to platformers. There are no enemies and it's impossible to die, so young gamers may quite like the lack of peril, simple controls, and sedate pace. On the other hand, anyone over the age of 10, and even that's being generous, will probably be bored stiff. While these snow-covered levels could fit into any wintry game, the summer section with its corresponding optimistic ditty is a breath of fresh air that's uniquely Frozen. Though with that said, it doesn't make the gameplay any more engaging, but the simplicity feels like less of an issue when you're swaying and humming along. Naturally, the song will be stuck in your head for days, but when it starts to annoy, you can just smile and think about what happens to snowmen in summer. They just become happy snowmen, right? Number 102, Beauty and the Beast, Roar of the Beast, 1993, Mega Drive. Released in the same year as another Beauty and the Beast game that we'll get to shortly, Beauty and the Beast Roar of the Beast is presented entirely from the point of view of Gaston. Just joking, obviously it's centered on the Beast. Whilst controlling said hairy protagonist, again the Beast, not Gaston, the player is tasked with defending the enchanted rose from invading wildlife, Belle from invading wildlife, and the castle from invading townsfolk, actually. With his brute strength, wicked claws, and titular roar, the Beast embodies a power fantasy for the boys the game was marketed at, except he's not terribly effective. His attacks feel lackluster, hit detection is very hit or miss, no pun intended, so the combat is frustrating, and even the boss battles don't rise above these problems. Dying repeatedly to bosses and chaff may be a design choice in some games, but not here. The title was criticized for its unintended extreme difficulty and how inaccessible it was, especially for young players. Short minigames periodically interrupt the action, but they feel like they're from a different game, and a screen stating "Well done, Beast" upon completion of a level feels hollow, as you know you'll be dead and back to the beginning again soon enough. At least the final confrontation with Gaston feels appropriately foreboding, set in the rain on the castle's rooftops against the backdrop of a sinister, turbulent sky. It's just a shame that most players didn't get that far. Well done, game. Number 101, Monsters Inc. Scream Arena, 2002, GameCube. Oh yeah, here we go, sports time! Does it count as a sport if you're a monster rather than a person? Yes, in our opinion, it does, but if this game makes me turn green or grow hair in weirder places, I'll be having words with that Mike Wazowski. Picking up directly after the events of the first Monsters Inc. film, Monsters Inc. Scream Arena is based in a facility dedicated to harnessing the power of children's laughter. After all, what's funnier than seeing others get hit by a ball? In the opinion of our writer, who as an 11-year-old was hit in the face by a basketball, literally anything. But she didn't make this game, and dodgeball is a popular pastime among the target demographic. Apparently, players race against time to hit all the targets, hold a specific ball for the longest, and even pelt chickens at opponents as they play through a series of arenas inspired by locations in the film. There's little here to keep your attention, and the game was criticized for a lack of variety among the arenas, its poor controls, and unintelligent AI. The multiplayer mode can be an acceptable party game for up to 4 players, but acceptable is just about the most generous adjective we can, in good conscience, use to describe it. You'd probably get longer-lasting fun from recreating the game yourself with Halloween costumes. Just make sure the balls are soft if you do. We wouldn't want any accidents now, would we? Number 100. Beauty and the Beast, Belle's Quest, 1993. Mega Drive. With only one entry separating her from her other half, Belle heads up this game just as The Beast did its counterpart. Where Roar of the Beast was action-packed and designed to appeal to boys, Belle's Quest noticeably lacks combat and was ostensibly marketed towards girls. Because we all know girls don't like fighting, but do like avoiding bats while lost in spooky forests. Hang on, no, I'm getting Snow White flashbacks now. The minigames at least feel appropriate and part of the narrative rather than shoved in for the sake of it. Utensil dodging in the kitchen serves as a reminder of the song Be Our Guest, and stocking shelves similarly brings to mind Belle's visit to the bookseller at the beginning of the film. While the Beast was too busy fighting to do anything else in his game, Belle stops to talk to the townsfolk, which gives the player far too much reading to do to work out how to progress. Levels that require directional acuity prove tedious, and Belle's lack of combat ability easily results in frustration when enemies meant to be avoided by either jumping or crouching appear simultaneously. We can't help but feel like this and Roar of the Beast suffered from being separate games. Where Belle's was passive and lacked oomph, the Beast's was dominated by mindless action. Together they could have formed a more rounded experience, but the arbitrary split to appeal to the gendered stereotypes of the time proved detrimental to both titles. Number 99. Tron Mazeatron, 1982. In television. A movie about being transported inside a computer was an easy choice for tie-in video games, and this entry marks the first and worst of the Tron titles. Players take control of Flynn while he's trapped inside the mainframe during the movie. This takes the form of a side-scrolling maze which proves to be a long, tense annoyance of managing energy levels, trying not to move off-screen, and avoiding the recognizers, the red gates that take a life and return Flynn to the beginning if they catch him. With only 3 lives, the wandering door frames are a threat to be taken seriously. By the time players reach the boss, it's a miracle if they remember how to fight it, assuming they read the instructions in the first place. Oh, who are we kidding? No one would have gotten that far if they hadn't. It wasn't unusual to need a manual in order to complete a game in the 80s, and while the title seems easy at a glance, the 25 pages of instructions disagree. That's twice as long as manuals that came with other Intellivision games released the same year and resulted in Tron Mazeatron being slammed even by fans of complex games. As one critical review noted, the challenge should come in the gameplay, not in understanding the instructions. This is one rulebook you definitely don't want to throw out unless you're getting rid of the game at the same time, in which case, be our guest. Wait, that joke probably should have been at the end of the previous entry. Ah, well. Number 98. Disney's Dinosaur, 2000. Dreamcast, PlayStation, PS2, Game Boy Color, and PC. If I told you about a game with dinosaur in the title that was based on the movie Dinosaur, you probably wouldn't immediately come to the conclusion that you spend a good chunk of time playing as a primate. That's what players got with Disney's Dinosaur, however, and the reasoning for this is apparently due to the fact that the titular dinosaur was raised by prehistoric lemurs. That makes the choice less odd, but still not a good one. As in the film, players take the dinosaur Aladar and his warm-blooded family on a quest to find a new home. Just how many tiny primates are going along for the ride depends on which version of the game you're playing, with up to 3 on the Game Boy Color. The PlayStation version has fewer playable characters, but this neatly avoids the issue of them feeling forced and unwieldy. When teamwork is required, these characters are shown interacting on screen rather than just swapping out, which emphasizes the themes of responsibility and friendship that are integral to the movie's emotional heart. Sadly, Disney's Dinosaur's strengths are overshadowed by it just not being very fun, thanks in part to unresponsive controls and bad collision detection that come together to make the experience a real slog. All the heart in the world can't fix frustrating gameplay, just as Aladar finding a new home won't stop that meteor. Although a mediocre game is arguably less of a tragedy than mass extinction, but only just, though. Number 97. Disney's Herbie Fully Loaded, 2005. Game Boy Advance. Herbie, a sentient Volkswagen Beetle who has stolen audiences' hearts since 1968, is fully loaded in this tie-in to the 2005 movie. We're not quite sure what he's loaded with because he has a noticeable lack of personality in the game, but with this being a racing title, how much personality could we reasonably expect? More than this. definitely more than this. Stills from the movie pop up between rounds as the love bug completes a series of races inspired by the film in which he has one simple aim: to consistently finish first. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on whether or not you like your video games to have an element of challenge, it's not difficult to win. Collect the power-ups to perform tricks and get into the lead, and Herbie's happiness will carry him the rest of the way owing to a speed boost given when the car is smiling. The main issue with the game was that the computer-controlled vehicles posed little threat and were criticised for their lack of racing competency. Additionally, with only 8 similar tracks, players were left with a game that was either short or repetitive. There was also no variation in gameplay. The movie features a demolition derby, so it's not like there was nothing to draw inspiration from, and something like that could have added a little variety and a lot of fun. In short, Disney's Herbie Fully Loaded leaves about as lasting of an impression as the car's expression in the corner of the screen. He's smiling! I think. Number 96. Ratatouille Food Frenzy, 2007, DS. Given how well cooking can translate to games, Ratatouille should have produced some tasty titles. While a fair game was cooked up for a tie-in, it's not this one. We'll get to that better one later in the list. Ratatouille Food Frenzy picks up directly after the movie, using the lingering look out over Parisian rooftops that closes the film as the first scene of the game. It's not quite as picturesque, but the intent is there, with an art style reminiscent of the movie's credits, but with tweaks to complexity and colour to make it less artsy and more appealing to a young audience. The game provides a set menu of 7 mini-games, but commits a sin on par with using the same knife for both raw meat and veg. Food Frenzy reuses minigames from the DS version of Ratatouille released just a handful of months prior. Fans could have been disappointed that there were few new games to play, or they could get together with a friend and play Spot the Difference. Most ended up in the former camp, and rightfully so. To make matters worse, the games aren't even very good. A constantly draining completion bar takes far too long to fill through boring gameplay that requires more concentration than it's worth. Furthermore, the touch input requires such precision that it's enough to hinder the progress of adults, let alone inaccurate children, and just rubs salt in the wound. Ratatouille? More like Rat Patootie. Got him, that's a line from the film. Number 95. Ariel the Little Mermaid, 1992, Mega Drive and Game Gear. When you think about The Little Mermaid, visions of romance, betrayal, and a singing lobster probably come to mind. This game has none of those things, so we're sorry to disappoint. Ariel the Little Mermaid takes inspiration from one particular part of the movie and tasks the player with saving either Ariel or Triton from Ursula's tentacled grasp. Follow a map to traverse the levels and collect the mermaids who have been turned into ugly, wiggly things as you go. Simple, right? But yes, actually, which was one of the main criticisms leveled at the game. Even on the highest difficulty, critics and players alike were disappointed by the lack of challenge. There's a choice to play as either the Little Mermaid or her mythical father, depending on whether the players want to sing at enemies or poke them with a fancy stick, but it doesn't make a difference other than visually. Attacks don't reliably go in the direction they're meant to, and the player character is hard to maneuver with a large turning circle that isn't great for swimming between fiddly bits of architecture or around the decks of a sunken ship. The game was too boring for adults, but the aforementioned faults alongside enemies with homing attacks and others that respawn make the game too unwieldy for younger players who could have otherwise enjoyed it. Without a clear audience, this game is best left on the shelf, or in Ariel's cave of whatsits and thingamabobs. Maybe she could use the cartridge as a coaster. Number 94. Big Hero 6 Battle in the Bay, 2014, DS and 3DS. We know what you're thinking, but Ben, the Big Hero 6 comics are Marvel, so isn't this a Marvel movie? Well spotted, but no. The film was not made by Marvel Studios, but was produced by Walt Disney Animation Studios and received Disney, not Marvel, branding. Now that we've addressed the elephant in the room, we can move on to the robots on the streets. Set after the movie, Big Hero 6 Battle in the Bay sees the newly formed superhero team protecting the fictional city of San Francisco from supersized fighter bots. Gone are the small but vicious machines that wouldn't seem out of place on British TV, and in their place are larger, less effective ones. An appearance from the fight's ringleader and previous champion suggests they're meant to be both bigger and better than before. It's just a shame that didn't translate to the gameplay. Only 4 of 6 heroes are playable, with the other 2 contributing special abilities activated from the UI, so bad luck if your favourite's now just a button, or bad luck if you have a favourite at all, really. Despite being functionally the same and equally powerful, the player is given no choice of who to control, as the heroes are assigned to specific levels. As the last ever game released for the DS, we would love to say the handheld went out fighting, but this game wouldn't even last one round against a regular-sized fighter bot. Number 93. Oliver & Company, 1989, Atari ST, Amiga, and MS-DOS. For those unfamiliar with Oliver and Company, it's effectively identical to Charles Dickens' original work. Just replace the boy with a kitten, the streetwise children with dogs, and the homeless criminal Fagin with a homeless criminal named Fagin. It's fine, he can grow plenty of hair on his own without having a feline or canine counterpart. The game follows the plot of the film, with players controlling the abandoned kitten Oliver to collect discarded hot dogs on the street of New York and catch dog biscuits thrown by disembodied hands, never mind that he's a cat, as he navigates his hard-knock life. Wait, that's the wrong orphan. The main complaints levelled at this title were that the controls were sluggish and much of the atmosphere of the film was lost. With no music beyond the title screen, the fantastic soundtrack featuring songs by Huey Lewis, Billy Joel and Bette Midler that brought the movie to life in a very 80s way is entirely absent. This means city streets don't feel as threatening or hopeless when they're reduced to collecting items against a cheery yellow background, and the gut-wrenching selfishness of Fagin trying to wreck Oliver's happy adoption becomes no more than a lengthy loop of preventing various acts of vandalism in Oliver's new home. Oliver and Company ultimately felt unsophisticated and repetitive, and while we'd happily keep the cat, we'd pass on second helpings of the game. Number 92, Return to Oz, 1986, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. The movie Return to Oz is an eerie, dark fantasy adventure that feels a little like what you'd get if you'd filtered The Wizard of Oz through Tim Burton's brain, added several helpings of creepy 80s claymation, and served it in a jack-o'-lantern, a mixture sure to delight and disturb in equal measure. Neil Gaiman reviewed it as one of the very best fantasy films I've ever seen, and whilst we don't know if he's played the tie-in video game, it's unlikely he'd be as full of praise for the title as he was for its inspiration. Return to Oz looks less terrifying than the movie, with its bright colours and simple images, but it follows the plot faithfully. While criticised for its comparative lack of atmosphere, it retains the movie's sinister tone and doesn't gloss over the less child-friendly parts. The gameplay and controls are extremely simple, but navigation of the story requires familiarity with the film. Even when limited to the actions at the bottom of the screen, it's practically impenetrable if you don't know the movie well, unless of course you don't mind a lot of trial and error when speaking to characters, collecting clues, and combining items. Most people would probably give up before thinking of using a chicken to escape a throne room. I know I would, but I don't need a pair of ruby slippers to return to reality. The console's power button will suffice. Problem solved. Number 91, Tron Solar Sailor, 1982, in television. Given that this game is also set during the movie Tron, it's unsurprising that Tron Solar Sailor, yes, that is the intended spelling with an E instead of an O, has the same objectives as the last Tron game on this list: to navigate the mainframe and destroy the Master Control program. The player pilots the Solar Sailor, a fast transport vehicle that flies along beams of data. Players glide through zones of the computer via these routes, trying not to go too far off course when switching tracks to top up the constantly draining energy. Reach the second phase and an 8-digit binary code is entered by catching ones and zeros on screen. This code is only given once though, so you'll either need to write it down or hope that your short-term memory is up to snuff. And this is the main problem with Solar Sailor. The lack of on-screen direction easily results in confusion. The game uses the IntelliVoice module, an adapter for the Intellivision console that enables voice synthesis to relay important information. A distinctly robotic voice gives out codes to progress the game, updates on your energy level and sector location, and tells you when you're under attack. It must have felt quite futuristic at the time, and as one of only 5 games that used the IntelliVoice, it certainly would have stood out. Except hardly anyone bought the module, so it had very few people to stand out too. Maybe that was for the best. Number 90, Beauty and the Beast, 1994, NES and SNES. This game feels like somebody looked at Roar of the Beast and decided that they could improve upon it. And they did! But not by much. Rather than defending his castle against invading wildlife, the beast is left to prowl around it, swatting spiders and crawling up curtains until Belle arrives. Then it's business as usual murdering wolves in the snow. The platforming is somewhat interesting, and time in the library makes a nice change from the dreary dungeon decor seen in the other levels, but it's not all good news. Beauty and the Beast featured several unexplained mechanics, such as roaring to make platforms move, that can leave a player stuck for hours as they look for an alternate route, simply because the game hasn't taken the time to tell them that this is something they can do. Why would roaring at a platform make it move? I know the castle's enchanted, but I don't remember the floors skittering about when the beast got shouty in the movie. Following the pattern set in the movie's other tie-in games, there's a congratulatory screen upon beating a level, but instead of feeling patronising, the "well done dear" seems appropriate coming from the motherly Mrs. Potts. Okay, so it still feels patronising, but in the fond way you tolerate from an older relative. Just smile and nod, she'll be asleep in the cupboard soon. Mrs. Potts. But if your mum wants to sleep in the cupboard too, that's her business. Number 89, Pirates of the Caribbean: The Legend of Jack Sparrow, 2006, PS2 and PC. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl was a movie that revitalized the pirate genre, and as the most captivating of its characters was Johnny Depp's eyeliner-loving scallywag, it's little wonder that Jack Sparrow is the focus of this tie-in. Set 2 days after the movie concludes, this third-person hack-and-slash has Jack retelling things in his own way. His unique perspective on events and characteristic flirtation with the truth sees him present where he actually wasn't, and bringing others along for a ride, so we see Jack helping Elizabeth to fend off the cursed crew of the Black Pearl in her bedroom and sack Nassau Port with her by his side. Destructible parts of the environment give options to defeat enemies other than just beating them to a pulp. Occasional minigames break up the violence without taking players out of the action, and a friend can drop in for local co-op. No friend? No problem. The AI-controlled character can stand around staring into space, get stuck on terrain, and block your path just like a real friend would. While players and critics were divided in their opinion, these tales entertained fans of the movie and led to the game having a fair user reception. Johnny Depp's reprisal of the swaggering seafarer doubtlessly carried the game further than it would have gone without him, as despite his colourful character, the legend of Jack Sparrow saw hefty criticism for its many flaws. Sorry Jack, not even sea turtles can save you from this game. Oh, maybe they can. Number 88. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl, 2003. Game Boy Advance. Another Pirates game so soon? As you can probably guess, this one isn't much better than the last. Despite having the same name as the film, Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl acts as a prequel to it and follows a much younger Jack Sparrow with only a passing resemblance to Johnny Depp and the wrong colour bandana after the mutiny that supplanted him as captain of the titular ship. Beginning in true pirate fashion with a walk of the plank, the narrative follows Jack's escape from being marooned on a small island, then through his adventures across the Caribbean. But these aren't his famous escapades. Instead, the player is treated to simple fetch quests for nondescript NPCs and unremarkable treasure hunts to pad out the runtime. Law-abiding seamen in Port Royal are little more than an inconvenience that can be walked around or quickly cut through without consequence, and enemy ships on the high seas stand no chance in battle. The game's difficulty, or rather the lack of it, was criticised for making the fights feel trivial, with even late-game enemies downed in a couple of hits. Confusingly, the game ends with Jack returning the cursed treasure to the Isla de Muerta and slaying Barbossa. Maybe we can chalk this up to Jack's fanciful storytelling, as it wouldn't be out of character for him to completely fabricate something like that. Who needs accuracy when you have infamy, eh? Number 87. Basil the Great Mouse Detective, 1987. Atari 8-bit, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. Styled after the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, Basil the Mouse shares both his Baker Street home and penchant for solving mysteries with Arthur Conan Doyle's legendary hero. The premise of the game is that Basil's nemesis, the criminal mastermind Professor Rattigan, has kidnapped Basil's own Watson, Dr. Dawson. In keeping with the Holmesian inspiration, Basil the Great Mouse Detective draws from the movie to create a new, thematically appropriate adventure with the same setting and characters rather than follow its plot directly. Simple platforming and enemy avoidance form the bulk of the game, while searching for clues about Dr. Dawson's whereabouts and scoffing dairy products break things up a bit. And this isn't just a quirk of the mouse. Bumping into enemies runs down Basil's energy bar, which a snack of cheese restores. Despite playing as the titular detective, more time is spent traversing the levels than solving mysteries. While the maze of rooms may require a bit of map reading, determining clues' legitimacy consists of reading how many are correct in the UI, and so hardly any deduction is required from the player. The title drew criticism for its lackluster platforming and poor controls that rendered one of the game's key mechanics impractical. Mousetraps can be used to incapacitate Rattigan's goons, but players often failed to place them as intended or set them down accidentally, which resulted in wasted traps and frustrated players. The only real puzzle here comes in trying to work out what the heck the devs were thinking. Basil would be so disappointed. Number 86. Monsters Inc., 2001. PS2, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. This entry sees us return to the Monsters Inc. factory, but with the movie as the focus, rather than ball games. Of the 3 versions of the game that were released, the one for the Game Boy Color follows the plot of the film most faithfully. A normal working day avoiding toys and scaring children as Sully and collecting paperwork as Mike takes a sharp turn when toddler Boo is unleashed on Monstropolis. Safely return Boo to the Scare Factory, go on an enforced holiday to the Himalayas, then battle Randall, complete with the hanging door chase sequence to save her. If an extra dimension is preferred, the PS2 version version is similarly focused on the story but was heavily criticised for its uncooperative camera. The release for the GBA offers something slightly different with its less story and more objective-driven plot. Randall has shredded Boo's door and scattered the pieces throughout the game, and it's the player's job as Sully to collect and reassemble them. A jigsaw minigame to do so is thematic and appropriate, but is also incredibly simple, and the game doesn't end after defeating Randall but instead repeats with a different monster in his place. Despite an admirable adherence to the events of the movie, the Monsters Inc. games proved to be little more than a selection of mediocre platformers that drew criticism for their lack of complexity, repetitive gameplay, and over-reliance on the license to carry them. Number 85. Disney Planes Fire and Rescue, 2014. Wii, 3DS, and Wii U. We come now to a game based on a not great Disney film that's a spin-off from one of Pixar's least good franchises. Off to a good start already. The story focuses on Dusty the Plane, famous crop duster turned racer who seeks a new career path as a firefighter after an incident of accidental arson. The game begins with Dusty's training, but this isn't just a quick tutorial. He didn't earn his certification in the movie from a quick zip around the park after all. Firefighting requires serious commitment to the tune of 30 training missions. That said, these missions are optional, but skipping them cuts about half of the game, as while the main missions are longer and more involved, there are only 12 of them. Surprisingly, this wasn't really criticised. Most reviewers saw no issue with the title's length as the controls were stiff and unintuitive and the gameplay was deemed so boring that players would quit before reaching the end anyway. Search and Rescue is less exciting when it comes down to just badly flying back and forth over unchanging landscapes, looking for something that's easy to miss. Occasionally, players take a ride in another airborne vehicle to complete different tasks, which brought a little variety. After all, while Dusty is a competent plane, he can't turn into a helicopter to pick up stranded deer. Yes, that is a tractor. No, it's not explained why the tractors are called deer. If players weren't familiar with the film or didn't think to Google it, this could have seen them scouring the landscape for Bambi in vain rather than for little green John Deere puns. Stupid. Number 84. Sorcerer's Apprentice, 1983. Atari 2600. Often hailed as one of the best animated films of all time, Fantasia gave audiences dancing mushrooms, ballerina hippopotami, and Mickey Mouse's disastrous experience as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. As much a celebration of classical music as it is an animated film, the beautiful visuals and famous compositions combine to create a stunning experience for moviegoers. It's Mickey's fraught encounter with enchanted brooms that's the theme for the game, which you could probably guess from the title. Beginning during Mickey's dream of conducting the cosmos, the player must collect falling stars and shoot comets. Each star caught translates to a bucket to aid the bailing in the second phase, and each comet left flying becomes a broom to work against Mickey. Fail badly and there's just too much water, too many brooms and not enough buckets to save the Sorcerer's Abode when you get to it, even with the ability to intercept the brooms as they march down the stairs. Considering that the Sorcerer saves Mickey in the film, it's more accurate to lose the game than it is to win, but that knowledge doesn't make losing fun. While the graphics and use of a few notes from Paul Dukas' symphonic poem were praised, the game was slammed for being repetitive, tedious, and incapable of retaining the player's attention. Mickey went to sleep instead of dealing with this similarly monotonous task of filling the well. We couldn't blame him if he chose a nap over this, too. Number 83. Atlantis: The Lost Empire, Trial by Fire, 2001. PC. Atlantis: The Lost Empire was Disney's first foray into sci-fi, however it failed to perform as expected when released and lost out on the top spot in theaters to Lara Croft Tomb Raider, which probably says everything about it more succinctly than we could. Atlantis: The Lost Empire Trial by Fire is a first-person shooter that begins 13 years before the movie and sees players attempting to retrieve a map given to the protagonist at the beginning of the film. This part of the game was distributed as a self-contained prequel to the movie under the title Atlantis: The Lost Empire Search for the Journal and could be found in several places including Kellogg's cereal and select copies of The Emperor's New Groove on DVD. The rest of the game follows the plot of the movie, from the attack on the adventurer's ship by a mechanical leviathan which isn't seen but players get to shoot its apparent spawn from an escape pod, to the threat of volcanic activity. While the premise sounded promising with puzzles to solve and crystals to collect while beset by enemies, a shooter was thought an odd choice for a film that featured very little violence. The title saw criticism for the lack of cohesion between the levels, with the story and objectives explained in screens of text between them. The graphics were subpar, the controls awkward, and the game as a whole failed to build any sense of atmosphere or immersion. As Atlantis is famously underwater, that last vault is particularly unfortunate. Peter?
Number 82. Fantasia, 1991. Mega Drive. In 1991, Fantasia the movie was completely restored for its 50th anniversary and came to home video for the first time, introducing a new generation to the musical masterpiece. After the successful release and the popularity of Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse the year before, gamers and families alike were ready for more Mickey. And they got it, but only for 100 days, as the game was subsequently recalled. While there is speculation about the reason behind it, with explanations ranging from an incorrectly granted license to Roy Disney, nephew of Walt, kicking up a stink because his uncle didn't want any adaptations of Fantasia, the outcome was the same. The game was removed from sale, and only an estimated 5,000 copies survived. The game is set within the dreams of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Beginning with a jaunt through his master's abode, players control Mickey through platforming levels inspired by the film. Make it to the end and be rewarded with the demonic climax of Night on Bald Mountain, complete with dancing imps and spooky faces. At least we think they're meant to be dancing. The game looked fantastic, with gorgeous graphics that recalled the scenes they represented, and the music was a recognizable translation of the orchestral originals. Gameplay obviously took its lead from Castle of Illusion, and was standard fare for an action platformer, except where that game delivered greatness, Fantasia delivered frustration. Development was rushed to get the game onto shelves before Christmas, and it was therefore released before it was ready, which resulted in unpolished gameplay, terrible controls, and a lot of upset amongst those who actually managed to score a copy. Number 81, The Jungle Book Groove Party, 2000, PlayStation and PC. The Jungle Book Groove Party, or the Jungle Book Rhythm and Groove if you want to get North American about this, is a musical rhythm game designed to get players up and active on their dance mat, and features iconic tracks such as The Bare Necessities and I Wanna Be Like You. Despite being a collection of tunes though, the game follows the plot of the movie surprisingly well, and the new songs made specifically for the title are in keeping with the story. A dancing introduction to the girl from the Man Village in particular wouldn't have felt out of place in the film itself. The quantity of the new tunes was criticised though, as they were used instead of, rather than alongside, all but 2 of the movie's songs, and had the Vultures sounding more like The Madness than the Beatles. Let's have a listen.
We're a little bored, we don't know.
The length of the game also lets it down for anyone with an attention span longer than that of a young child, with only 9 songs in the main game and 1 extra unlockable cover version of I Wanna Be Like You, bringing the grand total up to a pitiful 10. While the so-called crazy difficulty unlocked after completing the game on Expert is unlikely to pose a challenge to Dance Dance Revolution aficionados, the easier difficulties are suitable for younger children who just want to sing along and stamp their feet. So if nothing else, this game is fun for all the family. Just make sure those stamping children haven't just got socks on though. You want them to be king of the swingers, not king of the A&E department. Number 80, The Wild, 2006, Game Boy Advance. As a side-scrolling platformer based on the film of the same name, The Wild follows the tale of a group of animals from the Central Park Zoo. Stills from the movie provide context between levels, while said animals recount their rescue of a young lion after his accidental escape. Levels are separated between ones designed for the escaped lion's father, Samson, and others for Benny the friendly squirrel. This enabled the game to feature different styles of platforming, with levels full of climbing and swinging for Benny, and combat for Samson. Benny's hardly helpless though, as he's proficient at throwing nuts at birds. Burying them in the ground like a normal squirrel wouldn't be as effective, after all. The levels are themed around locations from the film, with sections of the game based in both New York and Africa. Boss battles represent pivotal moments, such as Samson's fight with the Vultures and the final showdown against the wildebeest leader, but both failed to impress. As well as suffering from unresponsive controls and awkward timings, the main criticism levelled at The Wild was that the story mode could not be played through in one go. Instead, the completed levels had to be replayed in solo mode, with certain objectives achieved within a time limit before the next story mode level unlocked. This artificially extended length brought nothing to the experience that wasn't already there, and made what was there feel worse. It's like regurgitating your starter at a restaurant just so you can enjoy it again before the main arrives. Lovely. Number 79, The Lion King: Simba's Mighty Adventure, 2000, PlayStation and Game Boy Color. We move now from the lions of New York to those of Pride Rock, with a game that acts as a biography of its titular big cat. The Lion King: Simba's Mighty Adventure follows Simba through the events of The Lion King and its direct-to-video sequel, with mercifully more than half of the game devoted to the original film. Recognisable events are depicted through the platforming levels that comprise the game, from Simba's flight from the tense stampede that prompted his self-imposed exile, to protecting his own cub once he rules from Pride Rock. Stills from the movie form the loading screens, and the PlayStation version features clips from the films between levels. The two versions of the game play similarly, but there are instances where the PlayStation version is more nuanced, such as during the fight with Scar. That said, it's not hard to be more nuanced than just pushing Scar back off a platform. Timon and Pumbaa provide short diversions from the plot through minigames that require the player to do things like catch bugs or sit on Timon. But if standing downwind of the warthog is as terrible as the duo's ditty suggests, we wonder if it would have been kinder to just hit said meerkat with a mallet like in traditional whack-a-mole games. While deemed suitable for the kids that were its target audience, the title was nonetheless criticised for its cookie-cutter format and lack of complexity, as well as the fact that it had little to offer past the first playthrough, even for the young and inexperienced. But hey, Hakuna Matata, right? Number 78, Adventures of Tron, 1982. Atari 2600. We're back inside the computer for another Tron tie-in now, and players actually get to control Tron rather than Flynn this time. Adventures of Tron, or Adventures on GX12 in Europe, was apparently intended to be an Atari version of Mazatron, but ended up being so different that it was given its own release. Lacking the worrying complexity of its supposed inspiration, this game's manual is an easily memorized 6 pages long. Thank Tron for that. Laid out as a set of 4 floors with elevators between them, the main objective is to collect floating bits. That's not us being flippant, that's what they're actually called in-game, while avoiding tanks, recognizers, and bugs that descend the floors, cross the screen in Tron's path, and, in the case of the tanks, attack him. Collect all of the floating bits and the game is won. Then jump into the beam in the center of the map so a points bonus is added to the score, and the game starts anew at a higher difficulty. While the title had no glaring faults, reviews were hardly full of praise. The accuracy required to avoid enemies was a common cause for frustration, as was the limit of 4 lives. The main criticism leveled at the game, though, was that while the first levels were easy, it became too difficult too quickly as the player progressed. When faced with more numerous and faster moving enemies, most players found the game maddening rather than enjoyable. Number 77, Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End, 2007. PS2, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. As Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest had no tie-in games on consoles, releasing one for At World's End seems peculiar at first glance. But while named after the third movie, the game actually encompasses the events of both films, as to do otherwise would have thrust players into the middle of the story with no context. The expected cast of Jack, Will, and Elizabeth, plus the not-so-expected Barbossa, are all controlled through the relevant parts of the story. There's none of Jack's embellished tales to put anyone out of time or place in this game, so players follow the plot to reconvene the pirate court and tackle the threat posed by Davy Jones. The levels, set in expanded locations from the films, have objectives to complete which break up the hack-and-slash gameplay, and boss fights take the form of duels, setting them apart from the often literally unwashed masses of minor enemies. While the combat in general was found wanting, and the jackanisms, quicktime events given a fancy name with drunken flair, were criticised for slow input response, the duels were actually praised for the variation in swordplay, until players realised they just needed to repeat the same few moves over and over and got bored. At World's End looked pretty good, and the voice acting delivered by the sound-alikes of the movie's cast was often fantastic, but that wasn't enough to patch the holes blown by the game's faults. Perhaps Davy Jones will come for this game next. Number 76, Finding Nemo, 2003, PS2, Game Boy Advance, GameCube, and PC. I think it's safe to say that not many child-friendly films are inspired by a trip to the dentist, but Finding Nemo is one that is. Since it was the highest-grossing computer-animated film ever until Despicable Me 2 snatched the crown from the clownfish 10 years later, it was inevitable that the game wasn't going to live up to its movie counterpart. This tie-in is primarily an action-adventure themed around events in the film, and contains scenes from the movie between the levels to tie it all together and tell the story. There's nothing super surprising here. The problem of a blocked path can be solved by depositing a pearl in a clam's jaws as Nemo, Marlin gets to chase Dory through coloured rings, and players are treated to tried-and-true mini-games of sliding puzzles and memory tiles with the forgetful fish. In hindsight, she probably wasn't the best choice for that. Critics generally applauded the effort of the developers to create a game for children that wasn't overly simplistic or boring for anyone outside the intended audience, except for the PC version, which was a simple point-and-click that was drastically different to its console counterparts. Unfortunately, the title suffered from a lack of variety in gameplay, and frustrated players with frame rate issues and long load times. Seriously, a wait that was commonly over 3 minutes long on the GameCube tested even the most patient player, actively disengaging the small children who were the game's only real fans. As such, those poor kiddos were left treading water when all they really wanted to do was just keep swimming. Number 75, A Bug's Life, 1998, PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, and PC. Based on the film of the same name that was the subject of a feud between Disney and DreamWorks, the tie-in to A Bug's Life is an action platformer that follows Flick, a misfit ant, through the plot of the movie. Key elements of the plot, along with the player's objectives, are communicated through annotated stills from the film, with the PlayStation version also featuring movie clips. Levels have the player collecting grain and pelting enemies with berries as they take Flick through locations and events that moviegoers will be familiar with. Puzzle-solving skills are required in some places in order to progress, as players must plant different coloured seeds that grow into various sturdy shoots and bouncy mushrooms to aid with platforming. Some of the environments are unimpressive and ugly. The cardboard city in particular is more of a ghost town than a major metropolis, and lacks the glowing lights and bustling environment of its movie counterpart. Others, though, are faithfully recreated. The giant raindrops and urgent music give the final couple of levels and boss fight an appropriate sense of weight and urgency, and Hopper is even defeated in a way that aligns with the movie, without robbing the player of their own sense of victory. While the game was praised at the time for its now slightly dated appearance and its accurate adaptation of the movie, the sluggish controls, coupled with frame rate issues, graphical glitches, and an uncooperative camera, overshadowed the game's positives in reviews. The Game Boy Color edition even lacked the puzzle-solving elements present on other versions, and so most critics consider that an even lesser offering. Number 74, The Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, 2008, PS2, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. As the lesser-known sequel to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, The Chronicles of Narnia Prince Caspian is set either 1 year or 1300 years after the first film, depending on what world you're from. The game portrays the events leading up to and including the eponymous prince's call for aid from royalty of the past, better known to audiences as the children who enjoyed the prior wardrobe-based shenanigans. Different characters and fantastical creatures from the movie are all playable, and on-screen party members can be swapped between at any time to make use of each of their capabilities. Smash around and ride giants as a Minotaur, squeeze through tiny spaces as a mouse, cut down enemies with debonair flair as Prince Caspian himself, and play as the children sometimes, I suppose. It's not completely avoidable, unfortunately. Critics celebrated the spectacle of the large-scale battles that ran smoothly with little to no drop in frame rate or responsiveness, and also the fact that many of the cast reprised their roles. However, the game saw more criticism than praise by and large. Simplistic gameplay, a slow-paced narrative, and inaccurate aim in combat and when solving puzzles raised the most ire. The DS version sat apart from the others due to its RPG-esque encounters and turn-based combat, rather than following the action-adventure format of the consoles, and whether you prefer this is really going to come down to a matter of personal taste. Prince Caspian was the last game developed by Traveller's Tales that wasn't a LEGO title, and the connection is evident in the gameplay here. Who knows, maybe this title would have performed better if it had been a LEGO game instead. Number 73, Enchanted, 2007, DS. Whilst being transported into a Disney movie may be a fantasy of many children, the opposite happens in Enchanted. Stereotypical princess-to-be Giselle is thrust into the real world and learns a few things along the way. Marrying a man you've just met seems less appealing once you discover the concept of dating. The tie-in game follows the plot of the film and takes place in both Giselle's homeland of Andalasia and in New York. The 3 playable characters have significantly different gameplay, with set levels for each. Giselle is paired with exploration and collection quests, Edward with action-focused sequences and turn-based boss fights, and platforming levels are Pip's domain. But everyone gets mini-games. Oh, yay. While the title was praised for its age-appropriate theme, controls, and difficulty, some of the mini-games were criticised as awkward and tedious, particularly Pip's boss battles. Yeah, you heard right, the chipmunk had boss fights. Additionally, the lack of choice about which levels to play or replay was criticised because of how vastly different they were. If a player loved the sedate exploration but didn't enjoy combat, for example, they needed a friend or family member to get them to the next section. You could say this encouraged cooperation, but really it just caused frustration that could have easily been solved by a level select unlocked after completion of the game. So instead of inspiring camaraderie, the title actually left players feeling disenchanted. Number 72, Cinderella Magical Dreams, 2005, Game Boy Advance. Inspired by Charles Perrault's fairy tale, this wondrous story of a downtrodden maid-turned-princess is one of Disney's classics, and boosted the company's popularity after World War II. Cinderella shows the titular woman's rise in spite of the evil machinations of her stepfamily, and Cinderella Magical Dreams was produced to coincide with the movie's release on DVD. With clips interspersed between levels, players take Cinderella and friends through familiar parts of the film, whether that's simple platforming as Cinderella to feed farmyard animals without stepping on chickens or newborn lambs, or scaling a wall of haberdashery supplies as Jack and Gus. The levels are thematic and fit well with the story. Boss fights with Lucifer see the mice pelting buttons at the feline menace, and a sequence of minigames has the player transforming the mundane into the magical as the fairy godmother, but not to the tune of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. The title's adherence to the plot of the movie was recognised by critics, the graphics met expectations, and the gameplay was deemed appropriate for a young age group. It was, however, criticised for its short length, bad collision detection, and potential to bore its intended audience. Cinderella's chores were repetitive, chores, and the game lacked peril throughout. Even her race home after the ball was more of an evening stroll despite the constantly scrolling screen, and the spooky forest failed to add a sense of impending doom. By the way, if any of you at home are drinking every time we mention a spooky forest, I suggest you stop now. This is a Disney list. What did you expect? Number 71, High School Musical 3 Senior Year Dance, 2008, PS2, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. While the first 2 High School Musical films were Disney Channel creations, the third had an increased budget and theatrical release due to the series' popularity. It was praised by audiences and critics alike and achieved the highest grossing opening weekend for a musical film up to that point. As with most games in this genre, High School Musical 3 Senior Year Dance places the focus on the songs rather than the story, but keeps each performance within its movie environment. Players have the chance to dance through the tunes from all 3 films and can choose which character to control. There's even the option to create their own Wildcat, meaning a student of East High, you can't play as an actual cat. Gameplay consists of stamping on a dance mat if you're the owner of a PS2 or Xbox 360, or swinging your arms around if you prefer to play your games on the Wii. The PC version lets players' fingers do all the work by tapping the arrow keys in a way that only Thing from the Addams Family would consider dancing, and the DS, confusingly, saw players circling the stylus around a face rather than engaging in rhythm-based movement. Senior Year Dance was praised for the accurate representation of the movie's performances and the control schemes that both made sense and worked. However, the game included many ballads unsuited to dancing, which eclipsed the positives as it left players feeling bored. If only the game had let players be a cat, the slow dances would have been far more interesting. Number 70, Tron Evolution, 2010. PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. In a step away from the previous titles on this list, Tron Evolution is tied to the 2010 sequel rather than the original Tron film. Acting as a prequel, this game sets the stage for Tron Legacy and introduces players to the characters of Clue and Cora. Players take control of the security program Anon, a thankfully silent protagonist. We dread to think what expletive-ridden tirades they'd go on if not, with a name like that. His purpose? To investigate infighting within the computerized world and take out viruses along the way through fast-paced acrobatic combat. Levels feature plenty of parkour, vehicular racing with a luminous trail, and a good old time blasting recognizers from a tank. The online multiplayer mode offers PvP classics like Capture the Flag and solo or team deathmatches, with the ability to connect to up to 9 other players. The PSP, DS, and Wii versions, the latter of which had the subtitle Battle Grids, are collections of minigames similar in theme to the console version, but with an emphasis on multiplayer and co-op. Tron Evolution was praised for its movie-accurate visuals, sound design, and atmosphere, and for the fact that the multiplayer was actually fun, albeit dependent on the quality of the other players. As for its downsides, the game saw criticism for its simple and boring combat, the short length of the single-player story, and that the majority of multiplayer maps were only available through purchased DLC. At least it wasn't all of them, I suppose, but still, that's not great. Number 69. Nice. Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest, 2006. PSP, Game Boy Advance, and DS. The movie of Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest had no tie-in for home consoles, but it did have this game for handhelds. In Dead Man's Chest, players control, you guessed it, Jack Sparrow through slashing and smashing action that follows the plot of the movie. The usual trio is rounded out with Will and Elizabeth on the DS, which gives players the opportunity, as said heroine, to skip the stealth from the film and instead cut a suitably piratical swathe through Port Royal in her wedding dress. She doesn't even get it dirty. Man, maybe she can give me some tips on how to save on my laundry bills. While the PSP and DS versions are third-person brawlers with the occasional puzzle or minigame, the GBA sails in a slightly different direction as an action platformer that also features nautical exploration and ship-to-ship combat as part of the main story. The PSP offers naval warfare too, but in a PvP mode, whilst the DS skips the ships entirely. Dead Man's Chest was praised for its runtime on the PSP and DS, and all versions were considered moderately fun. The combat, however, negatively impacted the game's reception, as it only required button mashing on the DS, was too easy on the Game Boy Advance, and the button prompt system on the PSP left Jack unavoidably open to attack when faced with several different enemies at a time. As the title was primarily a beat-em-up, these faults were glaring, and if a pirate can't fight, how good of a pirate are they, really? Number 68, Bolt, 2008, PS2, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. The titular Bolt is a crime-fighting, superpowered canine with a sonic bark. The movie centers around his discovery that he does not in fact have superpowers, and that they were instead all special effects for a TV show. The tie-in game takes the idea of said TV show and runs with it, with the game's story taking place inside the televised universe as Rhino, the hamster and superfan that Bolt meets in the movie, binge-watches it all on DVD. The game is essentially the show. Players take Bolt, complete with superpowers, and his owner Penny, complete with her wheelie bar thing, through daring escapades to save her father from the mustache-twirlingly evil Dr. Calico. While Bolt zips between enemies in stages focused on melee combat, Penny takes out the odd enemy but mostly wields her wheel bar to complete platforming sections. Hacking minigames break up the main levels and provide something completely different in the form of a bit of multi-directional shooting, which represents the computer fighting against the intrusion. The use of the TV show to create a game of espionage and adventure rather than just following the plot of the film was praised by critics, as was the game's appearance and appropriate difficulty for its target audience. However, both reviewers and players found Penny's stealth mechanics unnecessary and Bolt's combat repetitive and tedious. Even minor goons had too much health, and so every fight was a slugfest that dragged on well past its welcome. Number 67, Disney Planes, 2013, Wii, Wii U, DS, 3DS, and PC. We've already covered one game featuring the colourful aircraft, but now we've got one based on the original Planes movie rather than its sequel. With 4 different modes of play, Disney Planes offers more than just a flight through the plot of the film. Story mode does just that, of course, with players piloting the protagonist, Dusty Crophopper, and various other aircraft through the movie's race around the globe. Balloon mode, unsurprisingly, features poppable balloons, and the racing mode sees players flying their aircraft of choice through generic but planes-appropriate courses. Despite there being multiple opponents, the game only supports local co-op for 2 players, and the handheld version has no multiplayer at all. Free Flight lets the player enjoy just riding the wind and exploring the game's locations, whilst grabbing the occasional collectible, but it's replaced on the handheld by a challenge mode. This is made up of shooting targets, performing stunts, and everything else you can do with an aeroplane that doesn't fit into race mode. No, joining the Mile High Club isn't in there. This is a kid's game, not one from a dark corner of Steam. Ugh. Overall, Disney Planes was received better by players than critics, but neither adored it. Responsive controls meant the planes handled well, and the different modes were appreciated, but the title was considered too easy and was slammed for its mediocre to non-existent multiplayer, despite featuring races and challenges that would have been a perfect fit for fun with friends. Number 66, Tarzan Freeride, 2001. PS2 and GameCube. Everyone's second favourite ape-raised vine swinger, Tarzan, is the star of this tie-in to the 1999 animated movie that bears his name. Tarzan Freeride, or Tarzan Untamed if you want to get North American about this, is set after the events of the film and acts as a sequel to it. British explorers, as we so often do, threaten the jungle once again, and Tarzan must protect its inhabitants by taking part in extreme sports. Yeah, okay, sure. He lets some baby gorillas out of cages too, but as an action platformer, the focus is on Tarzan's athletic abilities. Run and climb, swing and slide, surf, water ski, and bungee jump through the game, before wrestling with the occasional boss in button mashing scenes that look a bit suspect. While the challenge mode has additional goals like completing the levels within a certain time or gaining a specified number of points for performing tricks, it doesn't change the fact that everything has just been recycled from the story mode. Tarzan Freeride, though, was praised for its graphics and for the fact that the controls and camera behaved themselves. It was also deemed suitable for children so long as they remained calm when faced with Tarzan's frequent deaths. The game had few checkpoints, and the action sequences lacked them altogether, and so minor mistakes at the end of a lengthy but otherwise well-navigated course left players stuck repeating it with building frustration. It was also criticised for being short, something that isn't usually said about Tarzan. Me, on the other hand, ho ho! Number 65, Disney's Treasure Planet, 2002, PlayStation, PS2, and Game Boy Advance. Robert Louis Stevenson's swashbuckling adventure Treasure Island was given a spacefaring twist in Treasure Planet. However, despite high expectations and a fair audience and critical reception, the movie was a complete failure and bombed at the box office, costing Disney an estimated $70 million. With a focus on platforming and puzzle solving rather than combat, but still containing plenty of the latter, Disney's Treasure Planet The Game follows the plot of the film, with fresh-faced Jim Hawkins on his hunt for treasure. While most of the game takes place on foot, it's occasionally broken up by races and chases on Jim's Solar Surfer, not to be confused with Tron's Solar Sailor. This is rocket-powered windsurfing without the water. Jim's shape-shifting pet, Morph, no, not that one, floats beside the player as a happy pink blob until he's needed, whether that's by grabbing collectibles on the PS2, acting as a hang glider on the PlayStation, or working as a controllable camera to scope out the environment on the Game Boy Advance. He's always there to help. Every version of the game had its forte. The boss fights on the PlayStation were more interesting than mindless brawls, the PS2's challenges on the Solar Surfer were actually fun, and the puzzles on the Game Boy Advance required thought to complete. All three versions of Disney's Treasure Planet had their faults as well, though, from inconsistent and unforgiving platforming to puzzles that frustrated and voice actors who sounded bored. While it wouldn't bag a place among Flint's treasure, this game wouldn't be a terrible consolation prize, but we'd still prefer the gold, thank you very much. Number 64, Finding Nemo: The Continuing Adventures, 2004, Game Boy Advance. We're back down under now for our dinner. I mean, our fishy friends again. Yep, it's just our fishy friends. While the movie's finale saw Nemo reunited with his father, it also threw some plastic and some questions into the ocean in the form of his bagged-up tank mates. Picking up where the movie left off, Finding Nemo: The Continuing Adventures confirms what happened to said escapees in the form of minigames themed around each character. Players pilot each of the tank gang on their perilous journey from the window of the dentist to the sea, avoiding cars and grabbing collectibles as they roll around like they're riding in aquatic hamster balls. Other characters appear once they've reached the Big Blue to help them get to Nemo's reef. Bruce can smash boulders to clear a path, and Nemo swims through rings to pop them, with an enraptured Bubbles looking on, naturally. Another version of the game by the same developer, Tron, arrived 2 years later for the DS with more minigames and a new subtitle. But with the same story and taking the same format, there wasn't much to actually differentiate them. While the presentation of the game and the variety of minigames were praised, Finding Nemo: The Continuing Adventures suffered from an inconsistent level of difficulty that frustrated younger players, bored older ones, and left its audience dissatisfied. It also still doesn't answer who got them out of the bags. Our money's on Bruce, though not for his not untying abilities. Number 63, Disney's Stitch Experiment 626, 2002, PS2. A chaotic alien turned household pet won over critics and audiences alike in 2002's Lilo & Stitch. Released just 2 days before the film arrived in cinemas, Disney's Stitch Experiment 626 explores what the alien was up to prior to his time on Earth. Stitch, the titular Experiment 626, must collect DNA samples for his creator's genetic experiments from several alien worlds. This involves a mix of platforming and shooting, where the player's apparent goal is to grab collectibles and achieve objectives whilst avoiding falls into lakes of acid or bottomless pits. I say apparent because the real goal seems to be causing as much mayhem and wanton destruction as possible. Stitch wields an energy gun more than suited to the task of destroying all in his path, including the occasional enemy when they unwisely appear, and while he has a grappling gun and jetpack in his arsenal, they're better used for transportation than annihilation. The absolute chaos that Stitch embodied, complete with cackles of glee as he blew things up, translated into the game well, which was partly thanks to the voice performance of Chris Sanders, who also provided Stitch's voice in the movie. The title was, however, criticised for its poor graphics, shoddy camera, a disappointing lack of enemies, and clipping errors that interrupted the platforming, left Stitch rammed in corners, and resulted in frequent unnecessary deaths. All we can say is that we hope Experiment 627 was far more successful. Number 62, Up. 2009, PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. While a story about a stubborn old widower might not sound very Disney, add a tear-jerking backstory, a little boy and a talking dog, and several thousand balloons, and we have liftoff, quite literally. After his house has arrived in South America, the elderly homeowner Carl and his accidental stowaway Russell explore their new locale through levels that mostly follow the plot of the film. While they have some overlapping abilities, Carl's hearing aid and Russell's bugle are functionally the same, for example, swapping between the duo is encouraged to navigate the levels. This has the player fending off enemies with Carl's walker, grabbing collectibles and insects as Russell, and solving puzzles with both to negotiate obstacles and open up routes for their passage to Paradise Falls. The title was praised for the return of the movie's voice cast, use of both protagonists, and the ease of the drop-in local co-op present in all versions, whilst criticisms included clunky controls, awkward camera angles, and a distinct lack of character in the DS version. While players enjoyed the title regardless of its faults, one of the biggest gripes was about the AI of the non-player character when the game was played alone. Set to dutifully follow the player, things worked fine most of the time, but caused positioning problems when solving puzzles. Still, thanks to the co-op, if lone players at least had a spare controller, they still had a possible fix, but if you've ever attempted to control two characters at once in a video game, you'll know that it's less fun than it sounds. Number 61, The Incredibles When Danger Calls, 2004, PC. Back when Spider-Man was Tobey Maguire and before Batman began, superhero movies were not as prolific as they are today. A movie based on a superhero family was therefore exciting and original, and so The Incredibles enjoyed a great amount of success. The Incredibles When Danger Calls is a collection of 10 minigames that surprisingly do follow the plot of the film. The game begins with everyday activities like catching crockery with a nightmarish glitchy arm as busy mum Helen, and lifting trains to get Bob back into shape. Each family member has their own minigame based around their powers, except Baby Jack-Jack, and then they all come together for the final battle against the Omnidroid, which consists of pressing the correct arrow key in a slowly moving sequence. Wow, what fun. Still, I suppose you can at least say that the title was suitably easy for a young demographic, with simple controls that were explained well at the beginning of each level, and a short runtime that made finishing the game achievable for the children it was aimed at. It did see criticism, however, for the same things that others viewed positively, with some saying that the game was too easy and therefore boring, and lacked enough content to keep audiences engaged. Why they would want more of a game that they were bored of, we're not really sure, but at least all of the negative reviews agreed on the same closing joke. In this game, the family weren't the Incredibles, they were the mediocres. Yeah, we groaned too. Number 60, The Incredibles Rise of the Underminer, 2005, PS2, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, DS, and PC. Continuing our look at the adventures of the Super Family, The Incredibles Rise of the Underminer was considered a canon sequel to The Incredibles until the second film was released 13 years later. The game starts where the movie finished, with the Underminer bursting from the ground with a declaration of superiority and his intent to rule over all. While the whole clan is there for this announcement, players only get to control Mr. Incredible and family friend Frozone in their attempt to halt his nefarious plans. Mr. Incredible is a strong brawler, and Frozone excels at slowing enemies and crowd control, which makes both useful and gives purpose to playing co-op. Otherwise, the AI does its best and follows the player character around to offer occasional help. The game throws plenty of enemies at the duo, but as an action platformer, the levels require more than just button mashing to complete. The Incredibles Rise of the Underminer has intuitive, responsive controls, great-looking ice effects, and the two characters' abilities worked well in tandem. But its awkward dialogue, lack of variety in enemies, and unhelpful camera worked against it. Limited lives caused frustration on the handheld versions, as did bullets that went around corners and through walls on the DS. Ultimately, it was thought that the title was appropriate for a young audience who watched the movie and wanted to know what happened next, but that there was very little to retain their attention once that curiosity was sated. Number 59, Ratatouille, 2007. PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox, Xbox 360, GameCube, Wii, Game Boy Advance, DS, and PC. We said we'd be back to the gastronomic powerhouse of Paris for a better Ratatouille game, and here we are. Where much of the movie follows Linguini, the human protagonist and live marionette, its tie-in focuses on Remy, the culinary expert who also happens to be a rodent. The title centers around Remy's move to the city and subsequent food-based experiences, with a couple of exceptions. The PSP version features adventures inspired by the film with an overarching goal to find recipes for Linguini and Colette's bistro, and the Game Boy Advance version places an emphasis on collecting ingredients and problem-solving, rather than the story. Platforming makes up most of the gameplay regardless of the version though, with puzzles and objectives to complete in various locations and the occasional action sequence to liven things up a bit. Minigames nest between the levels on the DS, while the previous gen consoles add multiplayer capabilities and confine them to a mode separate from the main campaign. The console versions of the game were praised for intelligent level design and intuitive controls, and the handhelds for fluid animation and exploration elements. Ultimately though, the title failed to impress. The then current gen version saw criticism for poorly depicting the story, the previous gen builds were said to have blurry textures, and the gameplay on the handhelds was considered simple, generic, and unchallenging. Still, while this title earned no Michelin stars, it at least wouldn't have been shut down for health code violations like the previous Ratatouille tie-in on this list. Number 58, Disney's Beauty and the Beast, a board game adventure, 1999, Game Boy Color. Neatly avoiding the issues of setup time and finding a big enough space in which to play, Disney's Beauty and the Beast, a board game adventure, is a board game adventure that takes the physical board out of the game and has no need for fiddly counters that get lost as soon as the box is out of its cellophane. Beginning with Gaston's rousing speech to the villagers, the premise of the game is to reach the beast before Gaston to warn him of the angry mob headed his way. Each square represents a minigame, and where the player lands on the board dictates what they'll face. The wardrobe leads to a tile matching game, Chip plays hide and seek in a game of swapping cups, and landing on Belle's father finally, blessedly gives players a chance to fulfill their fantasies and control Maurice. Performing well awards the player with stars, with a bonus game unlocked when they collect enough, which entails spitting as Gaston. No, I said spitting as Gaston, not spitting at Gaston, so don't get your hopes up. And also, don't think that spitting at anyone is a good idea, you are disgusting. A board game adventure was described by reviewers as surprisingly fun, a turn of phrase that complimented and damned in equal measure. The minigames themselves saw praise in isolation, as did the multiplayer mode that offered extra boards and additional minigames, but the small selection available in single player proved tedious, and the linear format of the boards was so uninteresting that even Snakes and Ladders was exciting in comparison. I mean, genuinely, a few snakes might have actually livened this up a little bit, that's all I'm saying. Number 57, Alice in Wonderland, 2000, Game Boy Color. Unlike The White Rabbit, Alice in Wonderland the game was not late for a very important date, as it came out 1 year before the movie's 50th anniversary, and so it had a very merry unbirthday instead alongside the film's DVD release. Following the plot of the movie, the title features illustrated scenes that tell the story between levels and portray Alice's interactions with the inhabitants of Wonderland. Players take control of the eponymous girl, and all the classic characters make an appearance at some point during the game. The Cheshire Cat gives a rhyming guide before levels, the Mad Hatter sends Alice on a quest to fetch biscuits for the Dormouse, and croquet with the Queen of Hearts is a suitably flamingo-flopping affair. The gameplay is wonderfully diverse, offering object avoidance in a falling sequence followed by platforming once Alice lands, races against the White Rabbit in bonus levels, and maze navigation to ease the workload of the playing cards by painting the roses within it red. Critics praised the variety the game offered and picked out the thematic use of Alice's change in size that added interest and thought to the platforming levels. However, some of the stages were considered too difficult for younger players, with trial and error mechanics that frustrated the less patient, while others were thought to be too easy. It just goes to show that you can't please everyone all the time, unless they're the Queen of Hearts, in which case you better please them all the time. Thankfully, no devs or reviewers lost their heads for this. We think. Number 56, Disney's Pocahontas, 1996, Mega Drive and Game Boy. Based on the plot of James Cameron's Avatar, based on the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia, Pocahontas portrays the interactions between the Native Americans and English settlers upon their arrival. While the film was an important milestone in presenting a strong female lead and indigenous people as more than a caricature, it still saw its fair share of criticism for historical and cultural inaccuracy and reliance on stereotypes. The game too is not free of these flaws, as it faithfully embodies the film in tone and content to its detriment. Players control Pocahontas and her raccoon familiar Miko through platforming levels that require swapping between them to solve problems, placing a focus on Pocahontas' connection with the land and life within it. Helping animals grants her abilities, whether that's an otter teaching her to swim or a bear allowing access to her spirit to frighten settlers in return for rescuing her cub. It's worth paying attention to the wildlife rather than just trying to barrel on through. The title was praised for its animation and the fact that it featured recognizable songs from the film, as well as the relaxed pace it encouraged. That said, its controls were unresponsive, collision detection on items like boulders that Pocahontas needed to manipulate for platforming was poor, and the game additionally saw criticism for its plain backgrounds, despite the clean, uncluttered look it gave the game. Additionally, the Game Boy version was stripped down to its most basic form and lost much of its atmosphere and charm in the process. Oh dear. Ben?
Number 55, Meet the Robinsons, 2007, PS2, Xbox 360, GameCube, Wii, Game Boy Advance, DS, and PC. Inspired by the picture book A Day with Wilbur Robinson by William Joyce, the movie Meet the Robinsons tells the tale of a preteen inventor, Lewis, and his encounters with a time-traveling boy named Wilbur Robinson. Set immediately before the film, its tie-in game sees players taking control of Wilbur through time-traveling escapades to recover a stolen time machine from the bowler hat guy and Doris, his hat. No, really. There's plenty of hazards to avoid and enemies to defeat as Wilbur pursues them and disrupts the timeline in the process, with suitably menacing bosses thrown in for good measure, except Doris, who even when enlarged to a giant size and given legs is still just a hat. The version for the GBA is significantly different to the others and features a story set after the movie, plus it's the only one that has Lewis as an additional playable character. While the music was thought bland when compared to Danny Elfman's film score, and several reviewers considered the gameplay similar to but worse than that featured in the Zelda series, this tie-in wasn't bad. Most of the praise was directed towards the appearance and atmosphere of the title for matching that of the movie, which was helped in no small part by the cast of the Robinson family reprising their roles, including Adam West as Wilbur's pizza-delivering uncle. Sadly, this uncle doesn't dance the Batusi, but he does get to wear a rather snazzy superhero outfit. Number 54, Chicken Little, 2005. PS2, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and PC. How could an old folktale about a chicken who thinks the sky is falling be improved upon? If your answer was with aliens, you've either seen the film Chicken Little or you should be working for Disney. Following the plot of the movie, players guide the titular chicken through action platforming levels to prove that he shouldn't be a laughingstock, that aliens do exist, and that he can save his town from them. As Chicken Little is notorious among the townsfolk for ruining everything he attempts, platforming as the gameplay's focus seems a hazardous idea, but at least when players mess up it's in character, I suppose. Flavorful minigames break up the platforming and smashing of mechanical chickens, with Chicken Little's fateful baseball game reliant on good timing, chasing a UFO through town, utilizing the player's racing skills, and an on-rails shooter to defend the town, testing their aim. The handheld version similarly featured different gameplay types, just not as many, and kept them in separate modes. This tie-in to Chicken Little was criticized for a camera and controls that misbehaved, and that the sheer variety of gameplay meant the title played more like a collection of minigames than a singular story-driven campaign. Other critics praised this variety and found the gameplay diverse enough to retain interest and challenge the player in different ways. Although this meant it was unsuitable for younger children, it remained kid-friendly and gave the title a broad appeal. Number 53. Pinocchio, 1996. Mega Drive, SNES, and Game Boy. Pinocchio the game came out several years after the digital restoration of the movie for its 1992 cinema reissue, and surprisingly wasn't timed to coincide with a home video release. It relied instead on the established fame of Disney's adaptation of Carlo Collodi's novel, and rode on the coattails of other, more successful tie-in games for that generation of consoles that we'll come to shortly. Taking the form of a puzzle platformer with a simplified version of the story told between levels on the pages of a picture book, the titular puppet makes his way through stages inspired by the film. While Jiminy Cricket only puts in an appearance to smack around some bugs, Pinocchio is the star with his Simon Says performance at Stromboli's puppet show, platforming escape from Pleasure Island, and a jumping and ducking raft ride to save his father from the whale's hungry jaws. Pinocchio was, in general, criticised for its short runtime and the simplicity of its levels. It was, however, an appropriate difficulty for children, and was deemed acceptably safe in terms of its content and level of violence, so that worried parents could allow their kiddos to play without fear. Additionally, the graphics, animations, and presence of recognizable songs from the film were praised, as well as the title's faithful adherence to the story. While Pinocchio may have had no strings to hold him down, he only managed to climb halfway up our list, but that's more than a lot of protagonists not made of wood were able to achieve. Number 52. Monsters Inc. Scare Island, 2001. PlayStation, PS2, and PC. It's time to say farewell to the Big Kitty and Mike Wazowski, as this is the last Monsters Inc. tie-in game on our list. Monsters Inc. Scare Island, alternatively subtitled Scream Team in North America on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, sees the duo sent on a training course to the titular Scare Island. Their aim? Learn to be as funny as possible. Just joking, this is set before the movie, not after it. They've got to scar the children, scar them for life. With the option to swap between levels, players choose to take either Mike or Sully through areas accessed via the central hub on the island. Despite featuring different environments, all have the same objective: collect primordial ooze to fill the player's fright meter, then scare robotic children of the corresponding color. Blue robots require the least ooze and effort, whereas the red ones require longer sequences of button pushing and for the fright meter to be full of ooze. While some reviewers criticized its ease, Scare Island's main downsides were voices that didn't quite sound like the characters, ear-splitting screams from the robot children that led to players muting the game, and distances that were hard to judge in the platforming sections. That said, the concept, level design, and platforming were simple and easy to grasp. Additionally, the controls worked as intended, and the proliferation of life restoration items meant that less dexterous players could recover easily from bumps into dangerous toys, so ultimately, the title was suitable for the young audience it appealed to. Number 51. A Christmas Carol, 2009. DS. We're sure that we're not the only ones who hear the title A Christmas Carol and immediately think of the Muppets, but the adaptation of Charles Dickens' novel this game ties into is the one that stars Jim Carrey and not Michael Caine. This Yuletide tale of morality plays out as a point-and-click adventure, with the story navigated by interacting with items to solve puzzles and through occasional minigames like knocking debris in front of a hearse chasing Scrooge in his vision of the future. Medals are won for the player's performance, and secrets and hidden items can be found throughout the game that contribute to a redemption score, which is just a Scroogified name for completion status. As a festive treat after the title's November release, Spot the Difference pictures were unlocked as an advent throughout the following December, which remained unlocked and were available immediately for those who accessed the game at a later date. The long narration sections were criticized, as while they were thematic and voiced, they were walls of text that did little to engage the player. Furthermore, the graphics and animation were considered below average and the runtime too short thought. You'd think the devs would have learned from Scrooge not to be stingy, especially at Christmas. Quality over quantity does count for something though. The puzzles and minigames were praised for an appropriate level of difficulty for its audience, and the overall title was lauded for retaining the darker tone of the movie. Minus points for the lack of Muppets though. Number 50. The Little Mermaid, 1991. NES and Game Boy. Darling, it's better down where it's wetter, unless you're a fish threatened with Ursula's mind control, in which case dry land might seem like an appealing alternative. Not to Ariel though, who when told of the sea witch's plans regrows her tail on demand and leaves Eric high and dry in an abrupt change to her MO. Players navigate a series of underwater levels in this game that's inspired by, but doesn't replicate, the plot of the film, uncovering secrets and breaking open chests to find upgrades to Ariel's attacks as she goes. Mind-controlled enemies litter her path, and players can deal with them by lobbing shells or trapping them in bubbles to then smash against the scenery or into other fish. That's certainly one way to save them from Ursula, but we're surprised there isn't a more friendly way to go about this. The idea of trapping enemies in bubbles was generally liked, but some critics found it awkward to pull off, especially when under pressure in boss fights, whilst others considered it a missed opportunity that, had it been explored, could have introduced more interesting mechanics to the gameplay. Overall, this tie-in to The Little Mermaid had a fair reception and was a particular hit with female gamers. The difficulty was suitable for its young target audience, and Ursula was menacing rather than frightening, though no one mentioned the mermaid's murderous rampage. Maybe that's really why Triton turned her into a human at the end of the film. She's our problem now. Number 49. Disney's Brother Bear, 2003. Game Boy Advance and PC. The animated movie Brother Bear tells the story of a Stone Age Native American tribesman, Kenai, who is changed into a bear due to his hubris and has to learn about the circle of life, the balance of nature, and get his ego in check before he can return to human form. Disney's Brother Bear is solidly in bear territory, with Kenai's transformation taking place before the menu screen. Subtitled stills tell the story, and players take both Kenai and Coda, the young orphaned bear he meets on his travels, through simple platforming levels. While most of the game is spent with Coda riding on Kenai's back, players can control them individually and swap between them to solve the occasional puzzle or grab the last collectible they need to unlock the minigames. Despite its extra dimension and visual differences, the PC version of the game is still a platformer and features similar gameplay concepts to the GBA, but only Kenai is playable, with Coda relegated to following along at his side. The title was criticised for levels that felt samey, blind jumps that caused unnecessary deaths, and the PC version for particularly difficult platforming sections that appeared out of the blue. Overall though, Disney's Brother Bear looked good, featured smooth animation and gameplay that was easy enough for younger players, but posed enough of a challenge that it wasn't a piece of cake. Which is good, because bears probably shouldn't eat cake anyway. Number 48. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, 2010. DS. This time, we're not talking about Mickey's avoidance of household chores, but Dave's in this tie-in to the movie of the same name. Known for its musical Tesla coils and not much else, Nicolas Cage was the brainpower behind the Fantasia-inspired film that sees him teach Dave sorcery to thwart the evil Horvath and Morgana Le Fay. The simply named protagonist, sorry, Dave's watching, makes his way through New York in a rough approximation of the movie's plot, battling enemies in different locales with a top-down perspective. Spells unlock throughout the game, along with trips to a magical realm to upgrade them, and these exciting visits to the colourful plane break up the combat of the main game with more combat, just with a different background. Enemies have auras that correspond to Dave's spells, which give him immunity to damage when he has a spell the same colour as the aura selected. This gives players the chance to mitigate damage when faced with multiple enemies or make up for poor dodging skills. While reviewers bemoaned the absence of Cage's likeness and the squandered opportunity for the spell system to provide tactical depth, the title was nonetheless praised for its colourful appearance and was fun in short bursts. It required enough thought to keep the kiddos engaged, while the repetition let them rely on what they knew worked to smite those pesky plastic bags. Number 47. The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, 2005. PS2, Xbox, GameCube, GBA, DS and PC. We're headed back to a Narnia well before Prince Caspian's time for this entry, with the tie-in to the most famous of the films that was based on the first and best known of the books. Featuring all of the Pevensey children as playable characters with drop-in co-op and character swapping supported, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe follows the plot of the movie where the siblings discover Narnia for the first time. All characters have their strengths, with Peter and Susan excelling in melee and ranged combat respectively, Lucy heals the others and fits through small spaces, and Edmund can climb, which doesn't sound impressive but is is useful, especially when needing to light the type of torch that doesn't come with batteries. The Game Boy Advance edition is a largely simplified version of the home console one and restricts players to one character per level. The DS version, however, introduces new features and even lets players control characters outside of the family unit. While the handheld versions were criticized for repetitive environments and poor AI, the main complaint aimed at the console edition was that its runtime was too short. Still, the action and visuals were praised. It made good use of the different characters both individually and when combined, and was an accurate adaptation of the movie. Along with the film and the book, this game is one of the best ways to visit Narnia, unless you can find a suitable wardrobe in your local charity shop. Number 46. Disney's Lilo & Stitch: Trouble in Paradise, 2002, PlayStation and PC. In contrast to the previous Lilo & Stitch title we covered, this one takes place on terra firma, and while it doesn't quite follow the plot of the movie, Disney's Lilo & Stitch: Trouble in Paradise, or just Disney's Lilo & Stitch if you want to get on the PlayStation in North America about this, has more bases in it than the cosmic travels of Experiment 626 did. With Stitch already adopted at the beginning of the game, players join him and his owner Lilo in their adventures and misadventures around her home island of Kauai. Fairly similar platforming levels with thematic links to the story comprised the majority of the game. A trip to the beach sees Stitch scurry around a sandy trail, bouncing on inflatable rings and destroying sandcastles rather than nearly drowning, and Lilo wields voodoo powers more potent than spoons in a jar of pickles. Occasional chase sequences switch things up a bit, with segments like Jumba's towards the camera pursuit of the Little Blue Menace and Lilo's side-scrolling race against tricycle-riding Myrtle, adding variation to the standard gameplay. This race, however, was criticised for its unforgiving nature, as it granted very little leeway, so even completing it with no mistakes was a close-run thing. The game also had poor collision detection in places, and critics found the graphics to be lacking, but Trouble in Paradise appealed to, and was enjoyed by, children who wanted to play as the young girl and her weird dog. Number 45. Tangled the Video Game, 2010. Wii, DS, and PC. Tangled the movie centers around Rapunzel, a young girl with an indomitable will and impressive barnet, and her quest to see the floating lanterns she's admired from afar just a little bit closer. Tangled the video game puts players in control of either Rapunzel or Flynn Rider as they attempt to achieve this goal, with coloring activities and mini-game challenges unlocked along the way. Rapunzel can, unsurprisingly, let her hair down sheer drops for Flynn to climb and use it to swing herself across gaps. She even lassos barrels off a ledge with it in one minigame. Armed only with her trusty frying pan, however, she stuns enemies but can't finish them off. For that, she needs Flynn, and players without a friend to help them out can swap between the couple at any time. The DS version removes the platforming and instead offers a stroll through various environments, with quests and minigames better suited to a much younger audience than that of the home console version. Rapunzel's hair, while long and luscious, had a habit of clipping through objects, and the minigame challenges were criticised for their ease, but this meant that no kids tore their hair out in frustration. Tangled the video game successfully recreated the feel of the movie through its close adherence to the plot, similar visual style, and the return of Mandy Moore and Zachary Levi as the main duo, which created a fun, thematic adventure for the film's fans. Number 44. The Incredibles, 2004. PS2, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and PC. Rated T for Teen by the ESRB, the tie-in for The Incredibles targeted a slightly older audience than the movie, which received a U or PG classification in most countries. It's unusual to see a tie-in game like this that cuts out the younger demographic through its content rather than difficult gameplay, but that's assuming parents paid enough attention to the rating at all. Levels follow the movie's plot, with Bob and his stereotypical strongman capabilities and a proficiency in close combat as the focus of the majority of the game, but the rest of the family get in on the action as well. Helen's elastic powers are used to punch enemies at range and swing around the environment. Violet's invisibility lets her sneak past guards, and hyperactive speed demon Dash gets to race through the jungle with tightly timed checkpoints. As a cartoony side-scrolling beat-em-up, the version for the Game Boy Advance is quite different to those for the home console and PC, but it still follows the movie's plot and additionally lets players skate through parts of the game as the icy Frozone. While The Incredibles had a camera that acted up during boss fights and an inconsistent level of difficulty throughout the game, it controlled well and retained the movie's atmosphere, in part due to Michael Giacchino's composition of both scores. The voice actors for the family's children returned, as did Samuel L. Jackson, and as he didn't drop any F-bombs, the title's rating isn't down to him. Instead, it's the cartoon violence cited in the content description, which sound about right for this action-packed game. Number 43. The Black Cauldron, 1986. Apple II, MS-DOS, Tandy 1000, Atari ST, and Amiga. Based on the Chronicles of Prydain, which were in turn inspired by Welsh mythology, dark fantasy movie The Black Cauldron follows the young protagonist Taran on his adventure to thwart the Horned King's evil plans. With an army of the dead and an overall sinister tone, the movie terrified young audiences and was criticised as too grim and disturbing. It bombed at the box office and didn't get a release on VHS until 1997, but it did get a video game tie-in. Players guide Taran through the events of the film, but with the potential for different outcomes depending on the player's actions and success, or lack thereof. It's possible to deliver Hen Wen, the pig that has a name better suited to a chicken, to the fair folk safely, avoiding her kidnapping entirely, and players can even get the magical sword back at the end. Like Return to Oz, the title required knowledge of the film, which put anyone who hadn't seen it in the cinema at a distinct disadvantage, but the potential deviation from the plot caused by the player's choices offered an experience that required thought rather than just memory to complete. The graphics, animation, and atmosphere of the game were all praised, as well as the inclusion of action sequences in addition to the expected point-and-click style gameplay. But without audible text, some of the characters' names left non-Welsh fans of the film understandably confused. Why are there so many F's in Feuda Flam? Totally unnecessary. Come on, Wales. Number 42. Chicken Little Ace in Action. 2006. PS2, Wii, DS, and PC. Chicken Little ended with an in-universe movie adaptation of the titular chicken's adventures. Chicken Little Ace in Action is the in-universe video game tie-in to the movie within the movie, while also a tie-in in our reality. It sounds confusing, but ends up being quite simple. Cutscenes showed Chicken Little and his friends playing the game, but their spacefaring counterparts are controlled by the player rather than the band of school-age misfits. Ace, aka Chicken Little, is an all-action hero who skipped leg day and carries out missions on foot. Runt gets a tank for slow but steady destruction, and Abby pilots a hovercraft in aerial combat sequences. The team is tied together by Mr. Fish, who sends them on missions and gives the player objectives, instructions, and access to locked areas via hacking minigames of increasing difficulty as the game progresses. Abby's hovercraft was awkward to control on the home console editions and was missing entirely from the DS version, and the amount of weapon-based violence in this shooter was too much for some parents, but with bloodless combat and no penalty for dying, the title was generally deemed appropriate for kids. Voice actors from the film returned for the game, and Adam West's Captain Kirk-like quips were praised for being suitably hammy without sounding contrived. Additionally, Ace's gameplay was compared to that of Ratchet & Clank, and while critics agreed that the original was superior, Ace in Action was not deemed a poorer quality imitation, but instead a simple but acceptable homage. Number 41. The Emperor's New Groove. 2000. PlayStation, Game Boy Color, and PC. It's time to get into the groove with a visit to Peru and the self-centered, arrogant ruler-turned-llama, Cuzco. Complete with the cynical sassiness that endeared him to audiences, the llama sachets through a series of 3D platforming levels inspired, but not limited by, the film, with in-game cutscenes that advance the narrative. A fraught trip downriver tied to a log provides a recognizable interlude from the standard platforming, and activities like shooting Yzma's shadowy minions with demonic llama spit trains the player for later levels where shooting targets reveals platforms. A llama-free zone is accessed mid-game by consuming a potion that turns Cuzco into a frog, and traversing areas and solving puzzles while he's in this form contrasts with the gameplay of his less bouncy one. The version for the Game Boy Color presents just 2 dimensions and sadly lacks this amphibious interlude, with Cuzco limited to llama-suitable headbutting and spitting, which is still a nasty habit, but we'll let it slide while he has 4 legs. While the camera got confused at times and the early levels were criticized for their simplicity, The Emperor's New Groove successfully carried over the movie's humor, had an acceptable difficulty curve with puzzles that required thought but stopped short of being frustrating, and the later levels in particular were praised for the solid platforming experience they provided. Well, I think that's all there is to say about this one. Better get to the next entry. Pull the lever, Kronk! Me. I'll pull it, I got it. Number 40. Enchanted Once Upon Andalasia. 2007. Game Boy Advance. Our algorithm monkeys had to work hard to place this entry, as despite having been released in 2007 and therefore being a prime candidate for some sort of online chronicling, this title has a surprisingly small presence on the internet. Once Upon Andalasia consists of a bedtime story told by the protagonist Giselle to Morgan, the daughter of her New York host. This tale of monstrous transformations and Shakespearean revenge sees the cartoon Giselle attempt to change the wildlife back to their original state and undo the upset caused to the kingdom so everyone can live happily ever ever after. Giselle's inability to fight, and each goblin being an innocent creature transformed, means the enemies encountered throughout the platforming levels require thought to face. Using traps to knock them out or Pip to distract them works wonders, and once incapacitated, Giselle can sing at their unconscious form to undo the curse and return them to fluffy cuteness. Grateful animals teach her songs, and these new tuneful abilities provide additional ways to tackle enemies as the game progresses, which keeps her from sounding like a stuck record. Despite the at times slow pace and the repetitive nature of Prince Edward's levels, yeah, he popped up occasionally to ride his horse and look heroic while saving maidens, the title retained the humour of the film and expanded on its narrative in a thematic way. The classic Disney-style visuals translated well onto the GBA, and Once Upon Andalasia provided a solid, albeit simple, platforming experience suitable for the young audience that played it. Number 39. WALL-E, 2008. PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. Set in a disturbingly possible future where humanity has turned Earth into an inhospitable rubbish heap and become entirely dependent on robots, WALL-E is a touching tale about the importance of hope, and a reminder of just how badly we could mess this planet up if we don't change our environmentally unfriendly ways. Corporations! The eponymous WALL-E, a surprisingly relatable trash compactor who's a lot more friendly than most free-thinking robots Hollywood depicts, faces a series of levels with platforming elements that follow the plot of an earlier version of the film than the final edit. Simple puzzles are scattered throughout, as are enemies for WALL-E to tackle by lobbing cubes of trash or disintegrating them with his laser. Eve, on the other hand, has a more explosive way to deal with obstacles and annoyances. Her arm-mounted cannon and full firepower capabilities are at the player's disposal, no pun intended, during rapid flying sequences. The then current-gen version suffered a grumpy camera and below expected graphical quality, the previous gens had clunky controls and no multiplayer, and the DS penalised mistakes too harshly, but all versions received praise for their successful recreation of the look and feel of the film, portrayal of the narrative in an engaging way, and for retaining WALL-E's unique personality. The immersion this created was enough to make many overlook the flaws of the game in favour of spending time with the pair of star-crossed lovers or zooming around trash piles as a robot who essentially poops out rubbish. I know which one I'd rather be doing. Number 38. The Princess and the Frog, 2009. Wii, DS, and PC. The Princess and the Frog gave audiences a thoroughly modern protagonist and the first African-American princess in Tiana, a woman with achievements born of her own hard work and dreams other than the usual fairy tale pursuit of marriage. The game is set after the film as Tiana fixes up her restaurant, but features parts of the movie and minigames that are triggered through Tiana's reminiscing with her friends and patrons. While these can be played alone, they're designed for multiplayer and give players the chance to have dancing contests, serve customers, and even engage in competitive snacking as frogs. Outfits unlock for Tiana as a reward, but not for the others, so if you don't like Naveen's vest, you're out of luck, I'm afraid. The DS version, as a puzzle platformer, is completely different. Players primarily control Tiana in frog form, but can swap to Ray, the Firefly, at any time to scout ahead or transform enemies into objects that help Tiana to traverse the level. The short runtime of the DS version was criticised, as was the overly competent AI on the Wii that proved hard to beat, which made a change from all the games we've seen with terrible AI, but was equally as off-putting. The minigames were considered solid party games, however, and with its jazz-based soundtrack, The Princess and the Frog had the same warm and rambunctious atmosphere as the movie and made perfect entertainment for a cozy sleepover. Number 37. Discs of Tron, 1983. Arcade. Originally conceived as part of the first Tron arcade game but cut due to time and hardware constraints, Discs of Tron was later developed as a standalone title that made use of a more advanced arcade cabinet to simulate battles inspired by the movie. Matches combined the disc-style combat famously featured in the film with the arena from the High Ally-inspired scene where players take on the role of Tron. In one-on-one battles against the computer-controlled Sark, the objective is clear: defeat him before he defeats you, then do the same the next round, and the next round until, in true arcade fashion, you either run out of tokens or rage quit. It's a simple enough concept and one that increases in difficulty as the game progresses. Sark becomes more aggressive and gains the ability to throw projectiles in addition to his discs that follow the player then explode, and alterations to the arena add new challenges in the form of multiple moving platforms, obstacles between the characters, and platform destruction. Where the 2008 enhanced port for the Xbox 360 garnered pretty mediocre reviews, the arcade original fared much better. The levels were engaging and the objectives felt achievable without forcing players to pour their savings into the machine. Furthermore, the 3D environment was a step up from the previous arcade game, and responsive controls, a synthesized voice for Sark, and the atmosphere created by the machine itself, especially for the seated cabinet version, made Discs of Tron a thematic and enjoyable game. Number 36. Brave, 2012. PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. Brave is a heartfelt tale of familial bonds and the importance of accepting people for who they are. Its video game tie-in, on the other hand, actually comes quite close to that, just with a larger emphasis on the action and a lot less on the animation of Merida's hair. The game begins with a synopsis of the story so far by Merida herself, complete with Kelly MacDonald's voice talents in a reprisal of her role from the film. It's then straight into the fray to free the land of Mordu's corruption, with players wielding a sword and conveniently unburnt bow as the princess and occasionally claws as her mother. Enemies need slaying and puzzles solving to cleanse the blight from the forest. Ability upgrades, better gear, and charms for Merida's weapons that give an elemental twist to her attacks increase her effectiveness as she goes. The fire charm is particularly useful when faced with ice monsters, which, if this game is to be believed, are quite prolific in the Scottish Highlands. The main criticisms the title received centered on its camera, which had issues following Merida when the player deviated from the expected path and zoomed so far out at times that her form was easily lost among the enemies or environment. Regardless of this wrinkle, Brave was praised for responsive, intuitive controls that suited both the twin-stick shooting and the hack-and-slash combat, a fantastic soundtrack, and excellent voice work that brought the characters to life. Number 35. Cars, 2006. PS2, PSP, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, DS, and PC. Disney Pixar's Cars follows the career of Lightning McQueen, a vehicle whose name is a tribute to the late Pixar animator Glenn McQueen rather than the actor Steve. But the latter's famed passion for motorsports gives the name a serendipitous association with racing. In a story that acts as a sequel to the movie, players get behind the wheel of the cocky red race car and the friends he made along the way as he trains for the next Piston Cup with a monster truck thrown in for good measure, because why not? Standard lap-based racing levels make up much of the action, whilst minigames are thrown in to break things up a bit. Players can look forward to such activities as practicing power slides and engaging in covert tractor tipping, which, in case you're wondering, is a reference to the rural pastime of cow tipping. Don't do it, please. The handheld versions all differ from the home console one, with the GBA getting rid of the minigames and the PSP most of the plot, while the DS version switches lanes and features more minigames than races. The GBA version suffers from a limited view of the track. The DS version was more of a jumbled collection than a coherent game, and the variants for home consoles had inconsistent controls and a wandering camera. Despite this, Cars was enjoyable and thematic, and was praised for the return of the movie's main voice cast, including Owen Wilson as Lightning McQueen and Michael Keaton as Chick Hicks, another name better suited for a chicken. Maybe he should be introduced to Hen Wen. Number 34. Cars 3 Driven to Win, 2017. PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Wii U, and Switch. We're changing games, but not gears, as we drift into another vehicular tie-in. It's Cars 3's turn to drive now, as it overtook the original to place fractionally higher on our list, and I'm going to stop here with the motoring references, otherwise this could get ridiculous. Cars 3 Driven to Win is a racing game that doesn't really follow the plot of the movie it's based on, but takes inspiration from it instead to provide the setting for its races. While the game features 23 characters from the film, all but 7 of the vehicles are locked behind gameplay and achievements. Different game modes offer various ways to play, from basic first to the finish and stunt-based tracks to high-stakes events that pit the player against the bosses of the game, and even a weaponized race with the goal to rack up as many kills as possible within the time limit, which feels a little out of character for the franchise, but never mind. While the visual effects caused performance issues and the lack of online multiplayer was lamented by critics, local multiplayer supported up to 4 people and was considered a fun group experience. Many reviewers praised Driven to Win for delivering a Mario Kart-style title with comparatively simpler races and controls that were accessible to its young audience, but didn't exclude the more experienced thanks to its difficulty options. They just had to remember to set it back to easy before little Timmy woke up. Number 33. Lego The Incredibles, 2018. PS4, Xbox One, Switch, and PC. Our first LEGO game on this list belongs to a family we're familiar with, so you'll know the drill by now. Superpowers, sibling rivalry, no capes, etc. Just this time, they're made out of plastic. As LEGO The Incredibles features an open-world format, the movie's plots are portrayed through a series of crime waves, which, despite the name, don't involve waves of enemies. Instead, they consist of a series of quests scattered about the map that sometimes culminate in a boss battle, with 2 new supervillains created especially for the game. Players get to step into the super shoes of a whole host of characters beyond just the Parr family unit, and can even get their friends in on the action thanks to the drop-in, drop-out 2-player co-op. Gameplay is formed of the usual LEGO title fare: smash bricks, assemble objects, use abilities unique for each character to defeat enemies, and more importantly, collect studs. The title was criticised for funneling players through the plot of the second film before the first, along with the playable roster filled by alternate costumes rather than unique characters. Shockingly, Bob didn't suddenly become more interesting to play when wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Despite this, LEGO The Incredibles was a solid addition to the LEGO lineup that looked and sounded great, featured gameplay that was accessible to a broad audience, and successfully combined the humour characteristic of the LEGO titles with that of the Incredibles movies. Number 32. Tron Deadly Discs, 1982. Atari 2600, and Intellivision. By now, you're probably wondering just how many more tie-ins the movie Tron could possibly have, but if we told you, it would ruin the surprise when there's another one. If there's another one. Okay, you got me, there's at least one more. Not to be confused with the arcade title Discs of Tron, Tron Deadly Discs is, you guessed it, a game featuring the disc-based combat from the film. There's a never-ending series of enemies armed with discs like his for Tron to face down, who increase in speed and accuracy between waves. Amidst dodging and deflecting their attacks, Tron can whack the doors around the arena to jam them open, which provides routes to teleport across it and the means to avoid getting stuck in the corner. Recognizers appear periodically to shut the doors Tron's broken and kill him if the player isn't careful, but can be forced to abandon their task with a swift disc to the eye. Tron moved slower than players would have liked, and the discs only harming enemies on their outward trip was considered a missed opportunity for thematic destruction on their boomerang-like return, but this did mean that the player had less to avoid, which was a blessing against later waves. Deadly Discs was praised for its graphics and sound effects, a suitable difficulty curve, and gameplay that was both challenging and addictive in the long term, as long as you were a fan of the wave-based format. Number 31. Disney's The Little Mermaid, Ariel's Undersea Adventure, 2006, Game Boy Advance and DS. Released to coincide with The Little Mermaid's arrival on DVD, Disney's The Little Mermaid Ariel's Undersea Adventure, alternatively subtitled Magic in Two Kingdoms on the Game Boy Advance, is a collection of simple minigames themed around the film. The DS version has only tenuous links to the movie and takes place at an unspecified point before it, where Ariel's days are spent doing chores for her father and collecting treasures. Sing into the microphone to repeat Ariel's tune if you're not tone deaf, blow into it to uncover treasure, and tap the screen, not the mic this time, to remove barnacles from priceless pieces of pottery and whatever else ends up on the seabed. In contrast to the DS, the Game Boy Advance edition follows the movie's plot faithfully and features annotated stills from the film between levels. Players go for a paddle as Flounder to collect treasure for the princess's collection, swim through hoops as Ariel to follow the eels to Ursula's abode, and scuttle around a basic platforming level in the kitchen with Sebastian to avoid becoming the dish of the day. The version for the DS felt repetitive due to the featured minigames being used multiple times, and players were disappointed with the GBA's short runtime, but most of the title's audience didn't mind, with the younger demographic entertained by the DS's interactivity, the GBA's adherence to the plot, and the opportunity to play with their favourite character in bite-sized pieces. But not literally, after all the aim is to avoid cooking Sebastian for supper, remember? Number 30. Alice in Wonderland, 2010. Wii, DS, and PC. Considering the sinisterly whimsical characteristic of his work, Tim Burton was the perfect choice to direct Alice in Wonderland's live-action adaptation, and with a 19-year-old Alice, it formed a sequel of sorts to the classic tale. The game follows the plot of the film, with the onus on several characters to protect and guide Alice through Underland. Each has their own unique talents, with the ability to swap between them to find the best one for the job at hand. Blocked routes can be uncovered with the March Hare's telekinesis, and the Cheshire Cat's dominion over invisibility exposes illusions and reveals concealed prizes, with everything color-coded to prevent the puzzles being too taxing. With a 2D side-scrolling format and a heavily stylized, cartoony look, the DS version is as different visually as Tweedledum and Tweedledee are similar, that is to say, very, but it still follows the plot of the movie and put players in control of characters other than Alice. The combat was simple, and the need to constantly destroy the environment to collect currency for upgrades annoyed critics. However, Alice in Wonderland was praised for puzzles that required the use of multiple characters to solve, and the successful translation of the movie's unique atmosphere and visual style into the game. Several of the main cast even reprised their roles, but not Johnny Depp or Helena Bonham Carter. They were probably too expensive. Number 29. Disney's Lilo and Stitch, 2002. Game Boy Advance. We're now joining the lovable Blue Menace on another interplanetary trip, but this time, Lilo's also along for the ride. In Disney's Lilo and Stitch, the titular alien shows that he knows the true meaning of family by commandeering a spaceship to chase down his human when she's abducted sometime after the events of the movie. A journey that's far from straightforward sees him battle enemy craft in a rapid shooter among the stars before a crash landing puts him in need of another ship, this time with a disgusting ooze monster in the way. Stitch's levels are packed with enemies in a run-and-gun type format, with the occasional wave assault on a stationary screen. Lilo lacks firepower, so her time on the alien vessel focuses on puzzle platforming and makes use of stealth, which includes convenient foliage concealed on her person to blend in with the very inorganic scenery. We're not sure how, but the tactic works. Maybe the aliens are used to sudden leafy appearances on their ship. I don't know. The title performed better with critics than players, as the latter found the game a little too difficult for the young audience it appealed to, although this same challenge added value for more experienced gamers. It had problems with pace, but the diversity of the levels was praised, along with the variety of gameplay styles. Overall, Disney's Lilo and Stitch provided a fun continuation of the duo's adventures, with great graphics, smooth animation, and buckets of personality.
Number 28, Disney G-Force, 2009. PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. With a plot that pit a team of guinea pig spies against killer robot appliances and an all-star cast, G-Force should have been a success, but the film received a less than enthusiastic response. Its tie-in game, however, fared much better. Despite a few deviations from the movie's narrative, Disney G-Force follows the same plot, with head rodent Darwin taking the lead. A competent agent despite his species, he can gun down enemies with the best of them. Plus, with a jetpack and whip also at his disposal, he's almost unstoppable. I said almost. When faced with a pair of gnashing doors and no desire to be tenderized, it's time for his colleague Mooch to take over. Able to fly through small gaps and temporarily slow time, he's the perfect solution to situations Darwin can't solve. Sluggish controls for Mooch and bland environments were common complaints from critics, along with the unnecessary inclusion of a, and I'm quoting here, anaglyph-based stereoscopic 3D mode on the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions that proved nauseating even when wearing the glasses that came with the game. The title was praised for its suitability for children, however, as well as the smooth animation and the superb voice acting of the sound-alikes and Sam Rockwell, who reprised the role of Darwin. This, combined with the game's faithful visual recreation of the film, led to a positive user reception and allowed players to immerse themselves in the small mammal's world without them needing to train their own team of guinea pigs. Number 27, Disney Sing It, High School Musical 3, Senior Year, 2008, PS2, PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii. We've already had a tie-in that allowed players to dance to High School Musical 3's catchy tunes, so it's only fair that audiences got one to sing along with too. And frankly, we're a little surprised there wasn't another title that let players do both at the same time. That might have been a good idea. Similar to Senior Year Dance, this title was named after High School Musical 3 and marketed with its branding, yet features songs from the entire trilogy. European fans got their hands on the game a month after the movie came to theaters, but those in North America had to wait another 3 until the film's release on home media. However, they got an updated version of the game with 5 additional songs as a trade-off. Rather than follow the lead of the Sing It game based solely on the first 2 films, Senior Year stepped away from animated visuals and the option for players to select their character, opting instead for live-action sequences from the movies that kicked the presentation up a notch, just at the expense of customization. Praised for its polish, lacking any glaring faults, and complaints about the short runtime assuaged by the extra songs in the North American release, the main sticking point for critics here was that the title was a little too streamlined. What you saw was very much what you got, with no special modes or fun effects that could have elevated it from a good karaoke game to a great karaoke game, albeit one that only really appeals to High School Musical fans. Number 26, Disney's 102 Dalmatians, Puppies to the Rescue, 2000, Dreamcast, PlayStation, Game Boy Color, and PC. 102 Dalmatians followed its more famous predecessor with a new litter fathered by Dipstick, one of the original 101. Cruella's obsession with fur, while briefly allayed thanks to hypnotic suggestion, is back in full force in this tie-in, with canine siblings Domino and Oddball the only ones who can thwart her newest dog-napping venture. Puppies to the Rescue takes characters and inspiration from the film, but presents Cruella as a toy designer rather than a fashion designer. Her henchmen from both films make bumbling appearances throughout, and the character's visual design is informed by the original animated film to benefit from the more easily recognised cartoonish style, except for LaPelt, who had no animated counterpart and so keeps his live-action depiction. Cruella is a persistent thorn in the player's side, but multiple boss battles have her comeuppance delivered via a pelting with fresh produce. Puppies are rescued from crates with a good smash, and collectibles are rewarded for completing minigames and optional objectives like herding pigeons. I mean, being set in London, it wouldn't really be complete without them, now would it? Critics were unimpressed by the similarity of the fights against Cruella and considered the gameplay too simple, but the target audience of young children absolutely lapped it up. After all, Puppies to the Rescue took them on a new adventure in a basic but fun introduction to platforming. So while the game couldn't perform many tricks, it was still deserving of a treat or two. Aw, good boy. Number 25, Cars 2, 2011, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, 3DS, and PC. Because no one should be confined to doing just one thing, Cars 2 saw the racing take a backseat to espionage, with the tow truck Mater recruited by the vehicular equivalent of the British Secret Service. Taking inspiration from the movie but not following its plot, the tie-in game of the same name presents races within several game modes that give players a choice of just how much James Bond-style excitement they want. A flavorful training sequence inducts players and their chosen car into the weaponized and tech-filled world of intelligence, and then the new agents are unleashed onto tracks with spy gadgets enabled, waves of enemies to defeat, PvP battles, and base defense. But those after a less explosive experience can still stick to basic racing. The DS version features additional stealth missions for Mater in a change from the lap-based races against opponents or the clock. The PSP's gameplay, on the other hand, is less engaging and consists of moving Lightning McQueen back and forth between lanes to avoid obstacles, overtake opponents, and grab pickups. Criticised for the lack of a story-driven campaign, but praised for the sheer variety and quantity of modes available, Cars 2 was mostly suited to being a local multiplayer game that friends could really sink their teeth into. Those less competent at racing found fun using the gadgets and seeing the characters they loved from the film, while seasoned racers appreciated the solid gameplay. In short, Cars 2 had something for everyone. Number 24, Disney's Aladdin, 1994, Master System and Game Gear. Prince Ali, fabulous he's on the Game Gear. Sorry, that's enough of that. Based on the highest grossing animated film of all time until The Lion King replaced human royalty with feline, Disney's Aladdin is an action platformer that places players in the street rat's shoes, except not literally because he's barefoot most of the time. Levels mostly take one of two forms: sedate sections, which include strolling around the palace with an occasional bit of jumping and incapacitating the guards in a move unlikely to endear him to his hosts, and more exciting object avoidance sequences, especially when the magic carpet gets involved. A ride through the endless diamond sky with Princess Jasmine sees the soaring ballad turned into a tense episode of bird dodging on a constantly scrolling screen, and Aladdin's race through the Cave of Wonders is similarly fraught. The final showdown against Jafar sees Aladdin armed in a thematic nod to the film, while the Vizier wields fire and transforms into an appropriately menacing snake, who just needs to be pushed off screen to trigger the cutscene that ends the game. While the title was criticised for the repeated format of scrolling chase sequences and for the sluggish controls, and was also subject to less than positive comparisons to the Mega Drive tie-in from the previous year, Disney's Aladdin was nonetheless praised for its graphics and sound design, adherence to the movie, and easy gameplay that was suitable for beginners. Number 23, The Jungle Book: Mowgli's Wild Adventure, 2000, Game Boy Color. Arriving on the Game Boy Color the same month as the Jungle Book Groove Party came to home consoles, this tie-in to the 1967 movie has a lot less dancing, but does actually feature music composed for the other game in its soundtrack. In the Jungle Book Mowgli's Wild Adventure, players take the animal-raised wild child through a series of platforming levels in an approximation of the film's plot, which unsurprisingly consists of various flavors of jungle, including King Louis's ruined temple and a rainbow jungle suited to Baloo's bright nature. Bagheera, in his role as the boy's mentor, provides disembodied instructions throughout the tutorial and carries Mowgli on his back in fast-paced action levels in lieu of boss fights. Other notable levels, unlocked by collecting tokens, see Mowgli using Kaa's body for platforming and relying on his own foot power to evade the pursuit of both Shere Khan and the wildfire. Completing the game rewards the player with 4 bonus levels that send them on a journey travelling to the left of the screen, in a deviation from established 2D platforming norms. The biggest criticism Mowgli's Wild Adventure received was for its runtime, as critics and players alike found its length cut their enjoyment short. The occasional change of pace mid-level frustrated some as well, but the gameplay, controls, graphics, and animation were all praised, as was Mowgli's ability to avoid enemies by throwing bananas to distract them, and then using said enemies as living trampolines to access higher areas. We're just not sure Bagheera would approve of that trick. Spoil sport. Number 22, Toy Story, 1995, Mega Drive, SNES, Game Boy, and PC. Based on the first fully computer-animated movie that marked the beginning of Disney and Pixar's successful collaboration, the Toy Story game gives Woody the limelight and follows the plot of the movie with only a few tweaks. The action starts out with simple platforming at Andy's party with a mission to unleash the army men for birthday present opening surveillance, followed by a race against Buzz once the players got the hang of things in an attempt to prove that Woody is just as fancy, up-to-date, and competent as his space-age replacement. Counterpart. Variety to the gameplay is introduced by occasional levels that deviate from the platforming norm. A first-person maze sends Woody through the guts of Arcade Machine to save trapped aliens, and a thematic but futile attempt to stop Sid from winning Buzz has him fling said aliens at the Claw using his pull string. These elements are, however, absent from the Game Boy version, which just sticks to the standard platforming and action levels, but does still end with the duo falling with style. Toy Story featured slow pacing at times, as well as clunky controls on the SNES specifically, and frustration was caused by having to restart the game upon death. That being said, although its difficulty made it unsuitable for younger kids, the game was praised for the challenge it posed, along with its effective use of tried-and-true gameplay, creating a title that appealed to a more experienced audience than the usual Disney tie-in game. Number 21, Disney's Tarzan, 1999, PlayStation, Game Boy Color, and PC. Disney's Tarzan, or Disney's Tarzan Action Game if you want to get really bad European title about this, takes players on a journey through Tarzan's life as seen in the film. Featuring clips from the movie to set the scene, tell the story, and let players bask in Phil Collins' glorious soundtrack, the game follows the original plot through levels that offer usual platforming fare in a 2.5D style. Tarzan is capable of all the things you'd expect the wild child, or wild man rather, to be capable of, including running on all fours, climbing trees, and falling in love with Jane, who comes crashing into the narrative with an extended dash from baboons. Despite the fact that Tarzan acquires a blade at certain points in the game, lobbing fruit is the Jungle Man's main method of defense, as it's largely more effective. Even Clayton can't withstand a few well-timed shots of his 5 a day. The Game Boy Color version places a bigger emphasis on enemy avoidance, especially so in sequences controlling the parasol-wielding Jane. While many of the enemies in the game were thought to have had too much health and the controls lacked the responsiveness critics expected, Disney's Tarzan was generally considered a quality title. The graphics, sound, and level design were praised, along with the traditional style of the platforming, the exploration required to find hidden items, and the inclusion of difficulty options that made it suitable for a wide wide range of players. Also, they got to trash the camp as Turk, like in that song from the film. This was literally an entire level, so, that's definitely a plus. Number 20. Atlantis: The Lost Empire, 2001. PlayStation, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Despite sinking at the box office, Atlantis: The Lost Empire offered up a couple of tie-in games before going under. We've already covered one that was better left on the ocean floor, but now it's time for the title more worthy of some buoyancy. Featuring predominantly action-focused platforming levels that follow the plot of the film, the stages in Atlantis: The Lost Empire are introduced by clips from the movie, and players get a selection of different characters to take on their aquatic journey. Each one has their own talents and can be swapped at checkpoints, which take the form of radios, and there are numerous puzzles to complete as the group seeks to save the lost city of Atlantis. The handheld versions take a two-dimensional approach, but are otherwise very similar to the PlayStations, and include brain teasers that require specific characters' abilities, such as Audrey's mechanical proficiency that allows her to interact with machines. The PlayStation gameplay was considered reminiscent of the Tomb Raider games due to its environmental puzzles and similar platforming elements. While the graphics were unimpressive and the combat somewhat awkward, Atlantis: The Lost Empire was praised for having multiple solutions to its puzzles based on which character the player was controlling, and for the variety to the gameplay that the vehicular levels brought. The title retained players' interest throughout its runtime, faithfully represented the film, and even caused more experienced gamers to overlook its simplicity due to the fun it provided. Number 19. Disney's Hercules, 1997. PlayStation, Game Boy, and PC. Featuring a hot-headed Hades and a protagonist with more brawn than brain, the Hercules animated movie portrays the adventures of the legendary son of Zeus as he builds his reputation as an all-round action hero, once he's past his awkward teenage stage, that is. Disney's Hercules, also known as, Hercules Action Game, or Disney's Action Game featuring Hercules, why do they have to do this, follows the plot of the movie and Hercules' quest to prove himself worthy of his birthright and a place amongst the gods. There's less focus on the romance from the film here, with the title instead putting Hercules through his paces in platforming levels that suit his vigorous nature. To ensure a rounded workout, there are plenty of enemies to put to the sword, paving slabs to be obliterated, and appropriately epic boss fights with mythical creatures throughout. Simultaneously praised for taking inspiration and gameplay elements from classic platformers, and criticised for its reliance on the traditional format, Disney's Hercules carried the charm of older Disney titles into the 32-bit console generation. Great graphics and high-quality animation paired with solid gameplay, which appealed to new fans and established gamers alike, made the title accessible for a wide demographic. Despite its inspiration, playing this game was not a Herculean task. But that being said, players did have the option to ramp up the difficulty and limit their lives if they really wanted to undertake a labour of their own. Number 18. Toy Story 2: Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue, 1999. PlayStation, N64, Game Boy Color, and PC. With Woody abducted and Andy's toys the only ones who can save him, it's down to the player to retrieve the cowboy in this tie-in to Toy Story 2. Fortunately, or unfortunately if you really wanted to play as Mr. Potato Head, it's Buzz who heads up Woody's rescue. Full of space-age tech and hard plastic resilience, Buzz overcomes obstacles and traverses platforming levels with his extendable wings and 2/3 of a triple jump. Enemies are no match for his wrist-mounted laser, as it does more than just point, and when used in first person, a reflection of Buzz's face looms large and clear, which gives a realistic touch to this otherwise fantastical game. Boss fights are scattered throughout to challenge the spaceman's combat prowess, and despite his name, Emperor Zurg has to be tackled properly rather than Zurg rushed. Reception to the title was not wholly positive. Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue was actually the target of a peaceful protest held outside Activision, as one of the villains, a unique invention for the game who didn't appear in the film, was regarded as an offensive Mexican stereotype. Disney apologized and announced the character would be altered, which it was, but only in subsequent versions of the game. Controversy aside though, the title was praised for its similarity to the film, Buzz's abilities which were wholly appropriate for the intergalactic toy, and for giving players the sheer joy of running around as their favourite Space Ranger. Number 17, The Jungle Book, 1994. Master System, Mega Drive, Game Gear, NES, SNES, Game Boy, and PC. Following the success of Disney tie-in games developed in previous years, The Jungle Book was given the same treatment and translated into a challenging platforming experience. With the plot of the film at its core, Mowgli is on a journey through the jungle to find the Man Village and take his place among his own kind. Exactly what that entails depends on the version, but the gameplay is largely the same across the board. Mowgli runs, jumps, and swings on vines in typical platforming style, while throwing fruit and jumping on enemies like the wild child he is. It's the level design and number of stages that differs between versions though, but all feature an additional objective of collecting gems. How many need to be collected, how fast, and the reward they grant depends on the platform as well. While the Mega Drive, for instance, offers bonus levels, the SNES adds the incentive of more continues. Boss fights also vary, so where most versions' confrontation with King Louie involves a tense exchange of fruit and bowling coconuts, or armadillos, the version for the Master System and Game Gear instead has Mowgli avoid falling boulders and orangutan caboose. While successfully grabbing vines was rather hit or miss, and some critics deemed the title frustratingly difficult due to blind jumps and unexpected damage, it was praised for otherwise responsive controls, quality platforming, and the visual treat it provided. Yes, The Jungle Book gave players more than just the bare necessities, and the few ants it contained weren't enough to ruin the fun. Number 16, Muppet Treasure Island, 1996, PC. Boasting 2 hours of video content and the appearance of both Tim Curry and Billy Connolly in scenes shot specifically for the game, Muppet Treasure Island ties into the movie of the same name that included a few more stuffed animals and fabric friends than Robert Louis Stevenson really envisaged for his swashbuckling tale. Accompanied by Gonzo and Rizzo, the player takes on the role of Jim Hawkins as they point and click their way through the story. A parrot is on hand, or rather on shoulder, to give hints, but much of the ambiguity typical of the genre is absent due to its young target audience. With interactable segments and minigames that involve launching pies at pirates and target practice with the ship's cannon, the player gathers the crew and sails to the titular island under Captain Smollett's leadership, until Long John Silver's inevitable mutiny, that is. Muppet Treasure Island was considered a competent, well-produced game. It entertained and sometimes challenged younger players, every scene looked fantastic, and the FMV of the actors and Muppets provided an on-brand and colourful experience that captivated both the kids and their Muppet-loving parents. It even ended with a farewell from Long John Silver that reminded players that the real treasure was the friends they made along the way, and this is before that became a complete and utter cliche. It's just a shame that it didn't include the songs, but that frankly gives us a good excuse to rewatch the movie. Number 15, The Hunchback of Notre Dame Topsy-Turvy Games, 1996, Game Boy and PC. Presented in the bell tower of Notre Dame by its animated gargoyles, Topsy-Turvy Games is a selection of mini-games inspired by the festival Quasimodo attends in the movie. Players can grab a friend or their own piece of ornamental stonework to face off in head-to-head challenges. Hovering above the chimneys of Paris sees them attempt to be the first to pop the other's balloons, while hampered, or helped, by the meddling of festival patrons. Competitive bowling sees Esmeralda's goat hurtling towards a cluster of human bowling pins, and a breakout-style block breaker determines who's best with a chisel. The The version for the Game Boy features a slightly different selection of games, with some slimmed down to better suit the handheld's capabilities and lack of multiplayer, and others replaced entirely. Throwing food is swapped for catching falling fools, and a word game for a picture puzzle. Critics praised the humour the gargoyles brought to the title, as their comedic quips set the tone perfectly, and voiced by the same actors as in the film, tied it tightly to the movie. Despite there being only 5 minigames, they kept the players engaged, and the difficulty selection both satisfied those of different skill levels and offered replayability as they improved, or aged. Sadly though, there wasn't a gargoyle difficulty for those of us outside the target demographic. Number 14. Disney Fairies, Tinker Bell and the Great Fairy Rescue, 2010, DS. Yeah, we were surprised that Tinker Bell and the Great Fairy Rescue wasn't a straight-to-video title too, but it did have both a UK and US premiere and showed in cinemas around the globe, and as such, its tie-in video game has earned a spot on this list. Released to coincide with the film coming to DVD, the tie-in is set at the fairy camp that Tinker Bell visits for summer. Rather than following the plot of the film, it focuses on the general experiences of the player character, a customizable fairy created at the start of the game, and the other fairies in attendance at the camp. An emphasis is placed on exploring the countryside and helping out the fairies via mini-games, including planting seeds, making flowers bloom, and guiding bees. Lizzie's house, while not the focus it is in the movie, makes an appearance as the location of a lost fairy, while the dark but not spooky forest and mushroom caves give the game a little visual variety. The title was praised for the film-accurate appearance of the characters, along with the intuitive controls and the variety of cosmetic items obtained throughout the game that incentivized collecting crafting materials. The inclusion of a separate menu from which to replay the minigames was welcomed, as was the open nature of the gameplay. Players could ignore the quests and fly around aimlessly if they wished, and with so many locations to do just that, it entertained even the youngest players who just wanted to smell the roses at their leisure. Number 13. LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean, the video game, 2011. PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, 3DS, and PC. Released to coincide with On Stranger Tides coming to cinemas, our final sojourn with Jack Sparrow and his piratical associates covers the first 4 films in the series. The story mode takes players through the movies in order, with colourful cutscenes that tell the story with a plasticized twist and the physical comedy integral to the LEGO games. Main characters are obtained by playing through this mode, and free play unlocks after each level. This gives players the chance to collect everything they missed the first time around, and use the abilities of subsequently unlocked characters to complete puzzles and access areas that were previously inaccessible. While Jack can search for treasure using his compass and Will's a dab hand at throwing blades, they can't, for example, blast through a jail cell's bars. No, that's for Marty and his blunderbuss to come back to later. With plenty of content and enjoyable replayability, LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean the video game was praised for its wealth of engaging gameplay and for the fact that the free play mode provided more than just a place to pick up collectibles. It was also considered an improvement on the previous LEGO game due to more easily wrangled controls, although they still weren't flawless. Overall though, the title provided a fun, captivating experience that players of all ages enjoyed, it entertained far beyond the first playthrough, and as the best Pirates tie-in on this list, is the worthiest of all to sail with into that horizon. Number 12. Jungle Book, 1996, PC. This title is not based on the 1967 animated movie and instead forms a tie-in to the 1994 live-action adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's stories. Despite its famous cast, this film lacks the presence in the public consciousness of its predecessor, though we suspect that the absence of musical numbers and talking animals might be why. Jungle Book's runtime is filled with clips from the movie and live-action scenes produced specifically for the game, with a Scotsman and chimpanzee guiding the player throughout. Interactable segments, simple choices, and occasional minigames come together to form the gameplay, and while it doesn't follow the movie's plot, the game's story runs alongside it to create a complementary adventure for the player. When their path crosses events from the film and Baloo is wounded, the main quest to recover King Louie's crown is put on hold to aid the bear. The game was packaged with a microphone to let players speak to the chimp, a gimmick that was divisive among critics. Some either found the idea of imitating an ape cringeworthy or were fine with the concept but not the implementation as it didn't reliably work, while others regarded it as a fun interactivity for children that set it apart from most other games. Teamed with the quality visuals and simple plot and presentation, Jungle Book was an enjoyable diversion for the kiddos who wanted a guided yet sedate exploration of Mowgli's jungle. Number 11. The Lion King, 1994. Amiga, Master System, Mega Drive, Game Gear, SNES, Game Boy, and PC. Arguably the most famous tie-in to the movie, The Lion King is likely among the games you envisage when thinking about great Disney titles, if you're of a certain age or fans of titles from the early 90s, that is. Beginning with the joyful adventures of the idealistic cub who just can't wait to be king, The Lion King sticks close to the narrative and visual style of the movie through savannah-themed platforming levels. Bright and relatively safe scrambles over giraffes and Simba's fraught but lush jungle exile contrast with the spooky hyena-filled gloom of the elephant graveyard and a shadowy Pride Rock marred by the sinister overtones of Scar's leadership. Or maybe that's just the music. While some critics and players deemed the title frustratingly hard even on the easiest difficulty, this was praised by others because it provided a tense and rewarding challenge for older and more experienced players. Bug-catching bonus games with Timon and Pumbaa offered a chance to earn extra lives, but the enemies posed a real threat and the platforming required thought and good judgment. Best of all though, the controls responded well, so mistakes were the player's own. Additionally, the graphics and sound were a delight, successfully communicating the mood of each level and adding to the enjoyment of the game, unless you were one of the parents who were exposed to only a fraction of the soundtrack ad nauseum because your kids couldn't get past the second level. Number 10. The Jungle Book, 1988. MS-DOS, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, and Amiga. Based on the 1967 film, but not related to any release, The Jungle Book appeared out of the blue and only in Europe, so the rest of the world missed out on this colourful adventure. With the play area viewed as a screen from the back of a cinema, the aim of the game is to progress through the story while keeping the audience entertained. It's a bit weird. Lose a life or get injured too frequently and they fall asleep, and if you send them all to the land of Nod, it's game over. The plot is loosely told through the changing environments and animals encountered, as Mowgli passes through the screens that represent the jungle, King Louie's majestic ruins, and the barren savannah as he's stalked by Shere Khan. Enemies are overcome with thrown fruit, apart from Shere Khan himself, who can only be stopped with burning rocks, but the ability to attack friendly characters means even Baloo can succumb to an overabundance of the bare necessities. Don't worry though, he respawns. Critics found the title's setting novel and the idea of audience engagement a unique way to keep track of players' lives, but were ultimately divided in opinion. The less enthusiastic thought it boring, while the more positive considered it charming, easy on the eye, and well suited to younger players. For them, the simple concept and lenient consequences were perfect and allowed the kiddos to wander the jungle without getting their feet dirty or begging for an expensive holiday. Number 9. Toy Story 3, 2010. PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Wii, DS, and PC. A final yee-haw takes us galloping into the best tie-in to the world of sentient toys, with Woody, Buzz, and cheerful cowgirl Jessie running the show. The story mode mostly follows the plot of the film, as Andy's toys regale their new friends at Bonnie's with tales of the gang's adventures. From a pull-string swinging good time at Sunnyside Daycare to careful balancing and heavy lifting at the junkyard, the trio each have a part to play with their unique capabilities. The Toy Box mode offers an open experience that contrasts with the story's linear structure. Set in the town from Woody's Roundup, the aim is to explore the Wild West and complete quests for Mayor Ham, develop the settlement, and unlock playable characters, which include Emperor Zurg on the PS3. Unsurprisingly, he has different goals to the rest of them. Its absence on the PS2 and PSP versions was unfortunate, as the Toy Box mode was praised as the star of the game and favourably compared to the GTA series, albeit in a much more family-friendly format. Either way though, the gameplay across the board was considered smooth, varied, and most importantly, fun, and the characters impressed critics and players with their similarity to their movie counterparts. The devs worked with Pixar to achieve this, and soundalikes, including Tom Hanks' brother, along with some of the original voice cast, meant they not only looked the part, but sounded it too. It's thanks to all this that Toy Story 3 is one title that definitely didn't stay mint in box. Number 8. Tron, 1982, Arcade. We said there'd be another visit to the computerized world of Tron, and here we are, with its first tie-in that came to arcades only a month after the movie's theatrical release. 4 minigames inspired by different parts of the movie test players' reflexes, adaptability, and tactical planning. Complete all 4 to progress to the next level, repeat this 12 times, and congratulations! You've beaten the game and emptied your wallet. Yes, doing so is easier said than done, as while the levels begin simply, the difficulty ramps up significantly as the game goes on. What starts as a few grid bugs to face in one minigame later becomes a veritable swarm. Similarly, one light cycle to force into a wall or into its own trail in a round of competitive Snake becomes several later in the game, and though they follow a preset path, it's not easy to remember between levels. Time at the helm of Tron's tank in a maze filled with enemies to obliterate, and a mission to blast through the MCP's constantly rotating and regenerating shield complete the title's lineup. Tron wowed in the arcades of the 80s and was praised for the minigame's variety, responsive controls, and both looking and sounding fantastically futuristic. It was considered one of the best coin-operated games at the time and for years afterwards, and a modernized version of the cabinet can even be bought today if you're so inclined, although it costs a little more to own than it did to play at your local arcade. Number 7. 101 Dalmatians, Escape from DeVille Manor, 1997, PC. It's time for man's best friend to face fashion's greatest foe once again in this tie-in to the 1996 live-action movie. Set after the Dalmatians have been secreted away in Cruella's country home, Patches, one of the puppies from Pongo and Perdita's litter, is determined to do as the title says and escape from DeVille Manor. Simple puzzles like opening drawers to create a climbable staircase are paired with point-and-click gameplay to allow the pooch to sniff out an exit route. While the creepy confines of Cruella's manor are no match for Patch's bravery, his newfound friend Whizzer, yeah, that's actually his name, is there to lend a helping paw when the player gets stuck, or needs a boost up a suit of armor to set a trap for Cruella's ever-watchful goons. Escape from DeVille Manor was praised for its lack of a game over state. Recapture by the henchmen simply resulted in the player taking a different path out of the manor rather than a setback to a previous screen, also leaving no room for worry about what the puppy's fate might have been. The environments conveyed Cruella's villainous nature without being too disturbing for children, and the gameplay was appropriately easy for its intended audience. It even delivered the explosive finale of the game Roger designed in the movie, and left Cruella both covered in muck and under arrest, like her live-action counterpart. Despite his name, Whizzer went the whole game without any accidents, but we'd have forgiven him for leaving Cruella a little reminder of his visit. Number 6. Disney's Aladdin, 1993, SNES. When the wind's from the east and the sun's from the west, you can find Abu wearing the mask of Tutankhamun. What's going on? Apart from the detour into a pyramid because Abu fell off the magic carpet, this tie-in roughly follows the Aladdin plot, with the young street rat facing platforming levels that put his acrobatic skills to the test. Whether dodging around Agrabah's market to slip from the grasp of thick-headed guards, or taking a colourful vacation into the lamp inspired by the genie's show-stealing performance, Aladdin makes good use of quick reflexes and a knack for evasion, honed through his existence one jump ahead of the breadline, plus a blanket he always conveniently has to hand. I suppose that helps. Armed only with apples and a fighting style that Mowgli would recognise, the focus is really on traversal of the areas rather than the enemies that populate them. Until Jafar needs to be defeated, that is. As apples bounce harmlessly off his scaly hide though, Aladdin's body weight has to do the heavy lifting as he treats the vizier's head like a trampoline. Complaints about the runtime being too short, and Aladdin's non-lethal combat abilities aside, the title was praised for its interesting and engaging level design, responsive controls, and platforming that wasn't too punishing, and for most got the difficulty just right. The recognisable soundtrack and fantastic graphics enhanced players' enjoyment, and the stage inside the lamp was singled out frequently as a high point by many critics for portraying the colourful character of the genie so creatively. Number 5. Fantasia Music Evolved 2014, Xbox 360 and Xbox One. In a change from the other Fantasia tie-ins we've covered, this title places the emphasis on the music rather than the struggles of the magically inclined mouse. Set long after Mickey's apprenticeship has ended, players become the sorcerer's newest student. But instead of wrestling mops, they are tasked with saving the realms of Fantasia from a malevolent force known as the Noise. The Kinect's motion controls are used to interact with the music of each realm, purging corruption and unlocking remixes through story progression and minigames. Classic compositions by Tchaikovsky and Vivaldi share the stage with tunes from Queen and Lady Gaga, and all provide a toe-tapping good time to which the player can thump the air to hit on-screen prompts. Just be careful you're not too close to the TV. Other than infrequent interruptions caused by the Kinect's occasionally spotty movement recognition, Fantasia Music Evolved had very few flaws. Critics praised the title for its rhythm-based gameplay that extended beyond just keeping a beat or staying in time. It encouraged creativity within the remixes and music-making minigames that let players explore sounds and chase what they thought sounded good, and it didn't penalise them for getting something wrong, because there was no wrong, just creativity. Getting the highest score, however, required concentration rather than using the game as a musical canvas, but regardless of playstyle, the only way to enjoy the silence with this title around was by playing the Depeche Mode level. Number 4. Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games, 1995, PC. When I was a young warthog, arcades were places of wonder and magic, and the youths inhabiting them no doubt dreamed of growing up and owning one themselves. It turns out, though, that arcade ownership isn't limited to humans, as demonstrated by Pumbaa in this 1995 minigame collection. Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games features a day out presented by the comedic duo at their newly unveiled food-focused Jungle Arcade that contains 5 minigames for the player to feast upon. A Frogger-style game of hippo-hopping sends Timon on a dangerous quest to collect 6-legged snacks that float along the river. Burper sees the gaseous warthog collect falling bugs and destroy undesirable items like fruit, yuck, in a cloud of digestive stink. And the fixed-position sling shooter pits the player's aim and judgment against cut-out targets and devious jungle denizens whilst avoiding friendly faces. Rounded out with a game of jungle pinball and the Tetris-like organisation of bugs in the duo's food stores, the title offers short, familiar and Lion King-themed minigames for 1 or 2 players. Critics considered Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games engaging, yet simple enough for young children to play, while high scores and a difficulty that increased with each level satisfied those that were slightly older, and gave an incentive for players to beat their friends or their own personal best. The most praise, however, went to the visuals that were reminiscent of Timon and Pumbaa's verdant home in the film, the accurate voice acting of the sound-alikes, and the entertaining commentary from the unlikely pair that ran throughout. It was still probably best to stay upwind of Pumbaa, though. Number 3. Treasure Planet Battle at Procyon, 2002, PC. In a step away from the platforming and party games that fill this list, Treasure Planet Battle at Procyon, and that is how it's pronounced in the game, I used to play this all the time, swaps character-based action for the real-time strategy of ship-based combat. Jim Hawkins' post-movie career in the Navy sees him sent to investigate pirate raids that are disrupting peace talks with a people known as the Procyons. Routine patrols give way to tense battles that hinge on quick tactical decisions, management of ship speed, and well-timed maneuvers to line up the gun facings for devastating broadsides. Unless you miss, and then they're not so devastating, you're really embarrassed and it takes precious time to reload. With an eventual fleet at his disposal, 4 ships to oversee, and a run-in with not 1 but 2 Long John Silvers, Jim's career keeps pace with his promised potential, all while he maintains his ultimate faith in the goodness of people. Aww. Critics decided that the pacing issues caused by some sedate sailing segments were more than made up for with exciting battles, smooth animation, and solid strategic gameplay. Ship movement was kept to a single plane, which emphasized the sense of sailing rather than flying, and ensured that both navigation and combat didn't become too complex for its target audience. Skirmish and multiplayer modes allowed players to try different ships and factions and test their tactical acumen, and while Battle at Procyon lacked the depth of typical RTS titles, it was considered a very worthy introduction to the genre for younger players. Number 2. Tron 2.0, 2003, PC. From the confusing Maze-a-Tron to the arcade classic, Tron tie-ins have really run the gamut of quality in this list. However, beating them all is this action-focused first-person shooter with a twist. Presented as a sequel to the film, Tron 2.0 is set 20 years after Flynn's adventure and sees a digitized Jet Bradley, the son of the programmer who created Tron, venture into another computerized world. With a virus running rampant through the system, a corrupt company executive working against him, and the threat of digitized human hackers waiting to be unleashed via the internet onto computers worldwide, Jet has no shortage of foes to face and plans to thwart. Armed with his disc and occasionally a gun to snipe enemies beyond the flashy frisbee's range, Jet has to fight his way through the computer to save himself and everyone else, of course. The bright neon graphics were applauded by critics for upgrading the movie's visuals without compromising its atmosphere. And while the title didn't feel like a typical first-person shooter, that wasn't a bad thing. Elements from different genres came together well to provide an engaging experience. Satisfying combat was broken up, for example, by high-stakes platforming segments and light cycle races, and the RPG-style upgrade system enabled flexible, customized playstyles. With its great gameplay, thematic appearance, and compelling story, critics and players alike found Tron 2.0 to be the Tron tie-in they'd always wanted. It's just a shame they had to wait 2 decades for it to come along.
Number 1. Disney's Aladdin, 1993, Mega Drive. By staying 1 jump ahead of the breadline and 1 swing ahead of the sword, Aladdin has stolen the top spot on our list with this beloved tie-in. Equipped with just a scimitar and the apples he collects along the way, Aladdin faces vicious criminals, environmental hazards, and a deceitful old man intent on his demise. But it takes a lot more than a wave of lava to halt the street rat's pursuit of his freedom, Princess Jasmine's hand, and Jafar's defeat. With locations from and inspired by the film and a tangible plot driven by text between levels, there's no compromise here between story, visuals, and gameplay.
Disney's Aladdin was widely acclaimed upon release, had no shortage of fans to sing its praises, and ultimately became the best-selling Mega Drive game to not feature a spiky blue protagonist. Critics and players were charmed by the responsive controls, challenging gameplay, and humour that made it easier to swallow those moments where you fell to its difficulty. Well, until Jafar taunted them from the game over screen, that is. The multitude of characterful moments came courtesy of Disney's animated animators, including some involved with the production of the movie itself, who worked directly with the devs in a groundbreaking first for Disney that paved the way for licensed games to come.
Many titles tried to replicate the success of Disney's Aladdin, but none quite managed to recreate its magic, as is evidenced by all of the previous entries on this list. All of which is to say, I suppose Aladdin truly is a diamond in the rough. Oh, thanks for watching.